Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's darkest family feuds, a story where a single flower became a symbol of both purity and bloodshed. Imagine a white rose, beautiful and innocent, chosen to represent the Virgin Mary herself. Now imagine that same rose stained with the blood of brothers, fathers and sons. For 30 years, England tore itself apart over a question that should have been simple: who deserves to wear the crown? But here is the twist. The family with the strongest claim to the throne was not the one sitting on it. And that injustice, that one overlooked detail about inheritance through a woman's bloodline, would cost England nearly 100,000 lives. So how did a flower meant to symbolize heaven's grace become the banner of a dynasty drowning in sorrow? Now, before we step into this tale of roses and ruins, I would love it if you could do me a small favor. If this story speaks to you, if you find yourself drawn into the world of medieval England with all its beauty and brutality, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Drop a like if the opening already has you curious, and leave a comment telling me where you are right now as you listen to this. Are you in bed with the lights dimmed, on a long drive through the night? I genuinely want to know, and hey, if you've got a fan running in the background or some soft rain sounds playing, even better. Let those sounds blend with the story. All right, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let us walk together through the gardens where the white rose first bloomed, and where it learned to bleed. Let me take you back to the year 1341. England is ruled by Edward III, one of the most successful warrior kings in the nation's history. He has 5 sons who survive into adulthood, and like any medieval king, Edward wants to make sure his boys are set up for life. So he gives them titles, lands, and most importantly, heraldic symbols, personal emblems they can use to mark their identity. His 4th son, a man named Edmund of Langley, receives the title Duke of York, and for his symbol, Edmund chooses something unexpected: a white rose. Now you might be wondering, why a rose? In the Middle Ages, the rose was not just a pretty flower. It carried deep spiritual meaning. The white rose, in particular, was connected to the Virgin Mary, a symbol of purity, innocence, and divine grace. It was the flower of heaven. By choosing the white rose, Edmund was making a statement. He was saying, "My family is blessed, chosen, touched by something holy." It was a bold claim, and as history would prove, it was also a dangerous one. Because here is the thing about symbols: they have power. Once you attach meaning to something, once you tell people that this flower represents your family's divine right to exist, you cannot just walk away from it. That white rose became the York family's identity. It was stitched onto their banners, carved into their castles, worn on their soldiers' uniforms, and eventually it became something they were willing to die for. But let us pause here and talk about why the York family even mattered in the first place. Because Edmund of Langley, the 1st Duke of York, was not exactly a power player. He was the 4th son, remember? In medieval inheritance, that means he was pretty far down the line. His older brothers got the good stuff: the throne, the wealth, the prestige. Edmund got a dukedom and a flower. So how did his descendants end up believing they deserved the crown? The answer lies in marriage. You see, Edmund's older brother, the 2nd son of Edward III, was a man named Lionel of Antwerp. Lionel was huge. Historical records say he stood over 6 feet tall, which back then was practically giant. But despite his size, Lionel had one problem: he only had a daughter. Her name was Philippa, and when Lionel died young, Philippa inherited his claim to the throne. Now, in medieval England, women could not rule directly, but they could pass their claim to their children, and Philippa's descendants eventually married into the York family. So here is where it gets complicated. Edmund of Langley's grandson, Richard of York, could trace his lineage back to Lionel, the second son, through his mother's side. That meant Richard had a claim to the throne that was technically stronger than the current royal family, the Lancastrians, who descended from Edward III's third son, John of Gaunt. Do you see the problem here? The Yorks had the better legal claim, but it came through a woman, and in the 1400s that was a massive issue. Medieval society had very specific ideas about inheritance. Sons came first, always. The idea that a woman could pass on a royal claim was controversial, even scandalous. It challenged everything people believed about how power should work. And the Lancastrian family, who had been sitting on the throne since 1399, were not about to let some dusty legal argument take away their crown. So they did what any powerful family would do. They ignored it. They acted like the York claim did not exist. And for a while that worked. But ignoring a problem does not make it go away, just makes it fester. And over the decades, as the Lancastrian kings grew weaker and their grip on power became more fragile, the York family started to remember that White Rose their ancestor had chosen. They started to think, maybe we do have a right to something more. Maybe we do deserve that throne. And here is where the tragedy really begins, because the War of the Roses, the 30-year bloodbath that would consume England, was not really about good versus evil. It was not about heroes and villains. It was about a legal technicality that no one could agree on. Should inheritance pass through the male line only, or could it pass through women too? It is such a small question, but small questions, when they involve crowns and kingdoms, can lead to rivers of blood. Let me give you some context about what England looked like when this dispute started heating up. The year is 1450. King Henry VI is on the throne, and he is, to put it gently, not doing well. Henry suffers from what historians believe was a severe mental illness, possibly catatonic schizophrenia or some form of psychosis. He has episodes where he completely shuts down, staring blankly at nothing, unable to speak or recognize anyone around him. Imagine trying to run a country when your king cannot even tell you his own name. During one of Henry's episodes in 1453, the government had no choice but to appoint a regent, someone who could rule in the king's place until he recovered. And who did they choose? Richard, Duke of York, the same Richard who had that stronger legal claim through his mother's bloodline. Suddenly, the man who believed he should be king was given a taste of what it felt like to actually rule. And once you have tasted power like that, it is very hard to give it back. When Henry recovered in 1455, he expected everything to go back to normal. He wanted Richard to step down and return to being just another nobleman. But Richard had seen how the kingdom could be run properly. He had made decisions, commanded respect, started to fix the chaos that Henry's illness had created. And now he was supposed to just walk away? Here is where you need to understand the personality of Richard of York. This was not a stupid man. He was intelligent, capable, respected by many of the nobles. He'd spent years watching Henry's French wife Margaret of Anjou essentially run the country because her husband could not. And Margaret hated Richard. She saw him as a threat to her son's inheritance, and she was absolutely right to worry. Because Richard was a threat, not because he was evil, but because he was competent. And in a kingdom being run into the ground by an incapable king and his ambitious queen, competence is dangerous. So Margaret made a calculated move. She convinced the nobles to force Richard out of his position as regent. She essentially told him, "Thanks for keeping the throne warm, but we will take it from here." And Richard, feeling betrayed and insulted, did what any powerful medieval nobleman would do. He raised an army. The first battle of what we now call the Wars of the Roses took place at St. Albans on May the 22nd, 1455. It was not a huge battle. maybe about 3,000 men total. It lasted less than an hour, but it was vicious. Street fighting, hand-to-hand combat in the narrow lanes of the town, and when it was over, Richard of York had won. He had captured King Henry himself, wounded but alive. The Duke of Somerset, one of Margaret's closest allies, was dead. And here is the heartbreaking part. This did not have to be a war. After St. Albans, there was a shaky peace for 4 years. Richard did not try to take the crown. He accepted his role as protector again and tried to work within the system. But Margaret never forgave him. She never forgot. And she spent those 4 years quietly building alliances, gathering support, preparing for the moment when she could strike back. Think about what this means for a second. England's fate was essentially in the hands of a queen who refused to compromise and a duke who believed he had been cheated out of his birthright. Two people, both convinced they were right, both unwilling to back down. And caught in the middle were hundreds of thousands of ordinary English people who just wanted to live their lives without worrying about which rose they were supposed to support. The White Rose of York. It started as a symbol of purity, of divine blessing, of heavenly grace, but by 1455 it was already beginning to mean something else. It meant defiance. It meant that some people were willing to fight for what they believed was rightfully theirs, even if that meant tearing the kingdom apart. And the saddest part is, nobody in 1455 knew just how bad things were about to get. They thought St. Albans was the end of it. They thought a little bloodshed would settle the question. They had no idea they were standing at the beginning of 30 years of horror. I want you to imagine what it must have felt like to be an ordinary person in England during this time. You wake up one morning and hear that there has been a battle. Some nobles you have never met fought each other in a town you have never visited. A few thousand men died, but life goes on, right? Except it does not, because now there are two factions forming, two groups of powerful families, each gathering supporters, each demanding loyalty. And if you pick the wrong side, if you work for the wrong lord or live in the wrong region, you could lose everything. Your land, your livelihood, your life. This is what makes the Wars of the Roses so tragic. It was not some foreign invader threatening England. It was not a clear battle between good and evil. It was family against family, neighbour against neighbour, all because of a question about inheritance that could have been settled with a simple agreement. But pride does not allow for simple agreements. And the white rose, that beautiful symbol of innocence, was about to be drowned in blood. The lesson here, the one that echoes down through 6 centuries of history, is this. Symbols matter. When you attach your identity to something, whether it is a flower, a flag, or an idea, you give it power over you. The York family could have walked away. They could have accepted that the Lancastrian line was in charge and made peace with it. But they had spent generations telling themselves that the white rose meant they were special, chosen, destined for greatness. And once you believe that about yourself, once you wrap your entire identity around the idea that you deserve something, it becomes almost impossible to let it go. Edmund of Langley, when he chose that white rose back in 1341, probably just thought it was pretty. He probably liked the religious symbolism, the connection to the Virgin Mary. He had no way of knowing that his great-great-grandson would use that same rose as a banner to march against the king. He could not have imagined that the flower he chose would one day represent one of the bloodiest conflicts in English history. But that is how legacies work, is it not? We make choices that seem small at the time, and then decades or centuries later, those choices echo in ways we never expected. Edmund picked a flower. His descendants inherited a curse, and here is the truly haunting part. The white rose was not the only symbol in this war. The Lancastrian family had their own rose, a red one. White rose against red rose, purity against passion, York against Lancaster. And when those two roses clashed on the battlefield, England bled in colours it had never seen before. So as you drift off tonight, think about this. What symbols do you carry? What beliefs have you inherited from the generations before you? And are those beliefs worth fighting for, or are they just pretty flowers that might lead you into thorns? The white rose bloomed in blood in 1455, but the real tragedy, the story that will break your heart, is still to come, because Richard of York, the man who had the strongest claim to the throne, the capable leader who could have been a great king, is about to meet a fate so cruel, so heartbreaking, that it will haunt England for generations. That is where we will go next, into the snow and mud of Wakefield, where a duke will become a legend, and where the White Rose will learn what it truly means to bleed. You know what is worse than having a terrible king? Having a king who is so mentally ill that he cannot even recognize his own wife. And you know what is even worse than that? Having that king's wife be more ruthless, more strategic, and more willing to spill blood than any man in the kingdom. Welcome to England in the 1450s, where the crown sat on the head of a man who sometimes forgot he was king, and the real power belonged to a French woman who would let nothing, not morality, not mercy, not even her own son's innocence, stand between her and victory. This is the story of Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, a king who wanted peace and a queen who understood that peace was a luxury she could not afford. And if you think the political chaos we see today is bad, wait until you hear about a medieval queen who personally led armies into battle, ordered executions without trial, and once let her 7-year-old son decide how 2 captured enemies should die. History remembers her as the she-wolf of France. But was she really a monster, or was she just a woman doing whatever it took to protect her family in a world run by violent men? Let us start with Henry, because you need to understand just how catastrophically unfit for kingship this man was. Henry VI became king when he was only 9 months old. 9 months. His father, Henry V, had died suddenly, leaving an infant to inherit the throne of England. Now, being a baby king is not necessarily a death sentence. You have regents who run things until you grow up. The problem was that Henry never really grew up, at least not in the way a king needs to. Historical accounts describe Henry as gentle, pious, deeply religious. He founded Eton College and King's College, Cambridge. He hated violence, preferred prayer to politics, and apparently had no interest in the kind of ruthless decision-making that medieval kingship required. One chronicle describes him as more fit to be a monk than a king, and honestly, that is probably the kindest way to put it. Henry would have been a wonderful priest. He would have been a terrible king even if he had been mentally healthy, but he was not mentally healthy. In August of 1453, something happened to Henry. The historical records are not entirely clear on the details, but the king essentially shut down. He stopped speaking, stopped moving, stopped responding to anything around him. He sat in his chair and stared at nothing. His attendants could not get him to eat, to acknowledge his newborn son, or even to recognize his wife. Modern historians think it might have been catatonic schizophrenia or some form of severe psychotic episode. Medieval people thought he had been struck by God's judgment or cursed by witchcraft. This episode lasted for 17 months. 17 months where England had a king who was essentially a living statue. Can you imagine the chaos? The government paralysed, nobles fighting for control, and all the while enemies circling like sharks smelling blood in the water. This is when Richard of York stepped in as Lord Protector, as we talked about earlier. But I want you to think about what it must have been like for Margaret of Anjou during this time. Margaret was only 23 years old when her husband lost his mind. She had a newborn baby, a kingdom on the brink of civil war, and a Duke of York who everyone knew had a better claim to the throne than her son. She was French, which meant half the English nobility already hated her, Remember, England had just lost the 100 Years' War with France, and here was a French princess married to their king. And to make matters worse, the marriage had been part of a humiliating peace treaty where England gave up territory in exchange for basically nothing. So Margaret had every reason to be paranoid, every reason to be afraid. And fear in medieval politics makes people dangerous. Here is where Margaret made a choice that would define the next 15 years of English history. She could have worked with Richard of York. She could have made him an ally, respected his position, and found a way to share power. Instead, she declared war on him, not literally, not at first, but politically. She surrounded herself with nobles who hated York, built a faction loyal only to her son, and made it clear that she would never, ever accept Richard as anything more than a potential traitor. Now, I want to pause here and ask you something. If you were in Margaret's position, what would you have done? Your husband is incapacitated. Your baby son is the heir to the throne. And there is a man with a legitimate legal claim who could, at any moment, decide that his bloodline matters more than your son's. Would you trust him? Would you try to make peace? Or would you do exactly what Margaret did? Assume the worst and prepare for war? There is no easy answer, is there? Because this is the tragedy of the Wars of the Roses. Almost everyone involved had legitimate reasons for their actions. Margaret was not evil for wanting to protect her son. Richard was not evil for believing he'd been wronged. But when two people with legitimate grievances refuse to compromise, the result is catastrophic. Let me tell you about the real Margaret of Anjou, not the she-wolf caricature, but the actual woman. She was the daughter of René of Anjou, a minor French noble who called himself King of Naples and Jerusalem, but controlled neither place. She grew up in a court that valued art, poetry, and culture. By all accounts, she was beautiful, intelligent, and well-educated. When she married Henry in 1445, she was 15 years old, 15, married to a man she had never met, sent to a foreign country where people already resented her, expected to produce heirs and stay quiet. But Margaret was not the type to stay quiet. And this is where things get interesting, because medieval queens were supposed to be decorative. They were supposed to pray, produce children, and occasionally intercede for mercy when the king was being too harsh. They were not supposed to lead armies. They were not supposed to make political alliances. They were certainly not supposed to be more competent at ruling than their husbands. Margaret did all of those things, and she paid for it in how history remembers her. When Henry recovered from his first bout of madness in 1455, Margaret immediately moved to sideline Richard of York. She convinced Henry to revoke Richard's position as protector. She stacked the government with her supporters, and when Richard raised an army in response leading to that first battle at St. Albans, Margaret was the one organising the Lancastrian counterattack, not Henry. Henry barely understood what was happening. Margaret was running the show, and here is where the story gets absolutely wild. In 1459, after years of political manoeuvring and small skirmishes, open war broke out again. Margaret raised an army, not as a regent, not as an advisor, but as a commander. She personally travelled to Scotland to negotiate for military support. She convinced the Scottish Queen to lend her troops in exchange for promises of English territory, and then she marched that army south. There is a battle in 1460 called the Battle of Wakefield. We will talk more about that later, but what you need to know right now is what Margaret did after that battle. The Lancastrians won, Richard of York was killed, and when Margaret's forces captured several Yorkist nobles, including a man named the Earl of Salisbury, they brought the prisoners before the Queen. She had them executed immediately. No trial, no mercy, just swift, brutal justice. But wait, it gets darker. There is a story recorded by multiple chroniclers that after the Battle of Wakefield, Margaret's 7-year-old son, Edward of Lancaster, was present when 2 captured Yorkist knights were brought before the Queen. According to the account, Margaret asked her son what should be done with the traitors, and little Edward, this child who'd been raised in the middle of a brutal civil war, said they should have their heads cut off, and Margaret complied. She let her 7-year-old son order executions. Now, some historians think this story might be propaganda. The Yorkists later won the war, and they had every reason to paint Margaret as a monster. But even if the story is exaggerated, the fact that it was believable says something about Margaret's reputation. People thought she was capable of that level of ruthlessness, and in medieval politics, reputation is everything. Here is what kills me about Margaret's story, though. She was not fighting for herself. She was not trying to become queen in her own right. Everything she did, every brutal decision, every political alliance, every battlefield, it was all for her son. Edward of Lancaster was her whole world. She had waited 7 years to have a child. 7 years while people whispered that maybe Henry was too pious for the marriage bed, that maybe God was punishing England by denying them an heir. And when Edward was finally born, Margaret poured everything into making sure he would inherit his father's throne. The problem was that Henry kept undermining her. In 1460, after the Yorkists captured Henry in battle, Richard of York made a deal with the king. Henry would remain king for his lifetime, but when he died, the throne would pass to the York family, not to Edward of Lancaster. Henry agreed to this. His own son disinherited, and Henry just went along with it because he wanted peace. Can you imagine how Margaret felt? She had spent years fighting for Edward's inheritance, and Henry just gave it away in one conversation. This is why Margaret could never stop fighting, because she knew that her husband was too weak to protect their son's future. If she did not fight, if she did not scheme and threaten and lead armies, Edward would end up with nothing. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of medieval politics, the role of women in a system that officially gave them no power. Margaret had no legal authority. She could not inherit the throne. She could not officially command armies or make treaties, but she did all of those things anyway because she had something more valuable than legal authority. She had will, she had determination, and she had a husband too weak to stop her. The chronicler Edward Hall, writing in the 1500s, described Margaret like this: "This woman excelled all others, as well in beauty and favour, as in wit and policy, and was of stomach and courage more like to a man than a woman." Now, Hall meant that as an insult. In his world, being like a man was the worst thing a woman could be. But read it again. He is saying she was intelligent, strategic, brave and strong. Those are not qualities of a villain. Those are qualities of a survivor. But here is the dark side of survival. Margaret's ruthlessness alienated potential allies. Her willingness to negotiate with Scotland, England's traditional enemy, made English noble question her loyalty. Her French heritage, which she could not change, made her suspect, and her obvious dominance over her husband made people uncomfortable. Medieval society had very specific ideas about how marriage should work, and a wife who was stronger than her husband violated every rule. There is a term historians use: unqueenly behaviour. Margaret was constantly accused of it. Leading armies? Unqueenly. Making political alliances? Unqueenly. Being more competent than your husband? Definitely unqueenly, but what was she supposed to do? Let her son lose his inheritance because she was too worried about being ladylike? This is the impossible position medieval women found themselves in. Too passive and you are useless. Too active and you are a she-wolf. Margaret chose to be the she-wolf, and England drowned in blood because of it. Now I know what some of you might be thinking. Was Margaret really that different from the men around her? Richard of York ordered executions. The Earl of Warwick massacred prisoners. Every male noble in this conflict used violence to achieve their goals. So why is Margaret the one who gets called a monster? The answer is complicated, but it comes down to expectations. When a man is ruthless in medieval politics, it is just politics. When a woman is ruthless, it is shocking, unnatural, evil. Margaret played the same game as the men, but she played it in a dress, and that made all the difference in how history remembered her. But let me tell you what I think the real tragedy is. Margaret was not stupid. She understood that every battle she fought, every enemy she made, was dragging England deeper into chaos, but she was trapped. Once you start down the path of violence, once you declare someone your enemy and fight them in battle, you cannot just stop. Because if you stop, if you try to make peace, you look weak, and weakness in medieval politics gets you killed. So Margaret kept fighting, year after year, battle after battle. Even when her armies lost, even when she had to flee to Scotland and then to France, even when her husband was captured and held prisoner, she kept fighting. Because what else could she do? Surrender? Accept that all those deaths, all that bloodshed, had been for nothing? There is a moment in 1461 that captures Margaret perfectly. Her army has just been destroyed at the Battle of Towton, the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. Her husband is in enemy hands. She has to flee with her young son through hostile territory, constantly in danger of being captured. And according to the chronicles, she was robbed by her own soldiers during the escape. Men who were supposed to be protecting her stole her possessions and left her with nothing. But she survived. She made it to Scotland, negotiated for more support, and within months was planning her next campaign. That is Margaret of Anjou, robbed, defeated, exiled, and still not willing to quit. So here is the question I want to leave you with as we move forward. Was Margaret a victim of her circumstances, or did she make choices that turned a political dispute into a bloodbath? Could she have made peace with Richard of York, or was war inevitable once Henry proved unable to rule? And most importantly, when you are fighting for your child's future, is there any such thing as going too far? Because Margaret was about to find out that there are consequences to being the most feared woman in England. Consequences that would cost her everything she loved. And the White Rose of York, wounded but not destroyed, was about to bloom again with a vengeance that would shock even Margaret's ruthless heart. That vengeance has a name and it's about to change everything. There is a special kind of person in history who never sits on a throne but somehow controls everyone who does. They are the puppet masters, the power brokers, the ones pulling strings from the shadows. And in 15th century England, that person had a name, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. They called him the Kingmaker, and that nickname was not a compliment. It was a warning. This was a man so wealthy, he could feed 30,000 people at a single feast. So powerful that he owned castles scattered across 20 counties, and so ambitious that he would crown 3 different kings in just 10 years, betraying each one when they stopped being useful. But here is what nobody tells you about the Kingmaker. He was not some villain twirling his moustache and cackling about world domination. He was a man with daughters and no sons, watching his entire legacy hanging by a thread. And in medieval England, that thread was fragile enough to strangle you. Let me paint you a picture of Richard Neville at the height of his power. The year is 1455, and Warwick is in his late 20s. He has inherited vast estates from both his father and his wife's family, making him probably the richest nobleman in England. We are talking about wealth that would make modern billionaires jealous. Historical records suggest Warwick's annual income was around £7,000, which does not sound like much until you realise that the king's income was only £10,000. Warwick controlled 70% of the royal revenue. Let that sink in for a moment. But money was just the beginning. Warwick understood something that most people miss about medieval power. It is not about how much gold you have, it is about how many people owe you favours. And Warwick had turned favour trading into an art form. He had hundreds of knights and gentlemen scattered across England who were loyal to him personally. When Warwick needed an army, he did not have to hire mercenaries. He just sent out letters, and men showed up ready to fight. Why? Because Warwick had gotten them positions at court, or settled their legal disputes, or married his servants into their families. He'd woven himself into the fabric of English society so thoroughly that you could not pull him out without the whole thing unravelling. Now, you might be wondering, if Warwick was so powerful, why did he not just make himself king? Good question, and the answer reveals everything about how medieval power worked. Warwick could not be king because he was not royal. Sure, he was descended from nobility, but there were dozens of families with equally good pedigrees. What made someone qualified to be king was not how rich or powerful they were. It was bloodline, royal blood. And Warwick, for all his wealth and influence, did not have a drop of it. But his daughters did. Sort of. If he could marry them into the royal family, then his grandchildren would have royal blood, his legacy would be secured. And this is where Warwick's story becomes a tragedy, because everything he did, every alliance, every betrayal, every political maneuver, was driven by one desperate fact. He had no sons. In medieval inheritance, daughters were better than nothing, but only barely. Daughters could not inherit titles in the same way sons could. Daughters could not lead armies or hold positions of power. Daughters were valuable only for who they could marry. So Warwick had a plan. He would find the right royal husband for his daughters, and through them he would control the next generation of kings. It was brilliant, ruthless, and doomed to fail in the most spectacular way possible. Let me introduce you to Warwick's daughters, Isabel and Anne. Isabel was the elder, born around 1451. Anne came a few years later, probably 1456. These were not political pawns to Warwick. They were his children, his only children, the only legacy he would ever have. But in medieval politics, love and strategy get tangled up until you cannot tell them apart. Did Warwick love his daughters? Absolutely. Did he also see them as the most valuable pieces on his political chessboard? Also absolutely. And here is where it gets fascinating, because Warwick did not treat his daughters like fragile flowers to be protected. He brought them to court, had them educated in politics and diplomacy, made sure they understood the game they were playing. Anne Neville would later say, well, we do not have her direct words, but chronicles suggest that she knew from childhood that her marriage would determine the fate of England. Can you imagine growing up with that pressure? Every potential husband is not just a person, he is a political alliance. Every conversation is a negotiation. Every smile has consequences. Now, let us talk about Warwick's relationship with Richard of York, because this is where everything started. Warwick's father was Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, who was York's strongest supporter. The Nevilles and the Yorks were cousins by marriage, connected through a complicated web of medieval family ties that would take an entire genealogy chart to explain. But the important thing is this: when Richard of York needed an army to challenge the Lancastrian government, Warwick provided it. And when York needed someone to actually lead that army, because, let us be honest, York was a better politician than soldier, Warwick stepped up. The Battle of St. Albans in 1455 was Warwick's first real taste of military command, and he discovered something interesting. He was good at it, not necessarily as a tactical genius, but as a psychological warrior. Warwick understood that medieval battles were as much about morale and momentum as they were about swords and shields. At St. Albans, he did not just defeat the Lancastrian army, he made sure the victory was decisive, shocking, impossible to ignore. And then he did something that would become his signature move. He ordered the execution of captured enemies. Now, this was not unusual in medieval warfare. Nobles usually got ransomed back to their families. You could make a lot of money that way. But Warwick understood that sometimes fear is more valuable than gold. By executing the Duke of Somerset and several other Lancastrian leaders, Warwick sent a message. If you fight against us, we will not negotiate. We will not show mercy. We will end you. It worked. For a while, the Lancastrian faction was terrified, and Richard of York, grateful for the victory, rewarded Warwick with even more power and influence. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. Warwick was the power behind the throne, the indispensable man, the one everyone needed. But here is the thing about being indispensable. It only works as long as everyone agrees you are indispensable. And in 1460 something happened that would eventually destroy Warwick's carefully constructed world. Richard of York died. We will talk more about how that happened later, but what matters right now is the consequence. York's eldest son, Edward, became the new leader of the Yorkist faction, and Edward was 19 years old, tall, handsome, charismatic, and, this is crucial, not nearly as grateful or obedient as his father had been. Warwick probably thought he could control young Edward the same way he'd guided Richard of York. After all, Edward was basically a kid. Sure, he was brave in battle and people loved him, but he needed experienced advisors to actually run a kingdom. He needed someone like Warwick to make the real decisions while Edward smiled and waved and looked regal. Except Edward had other ideas, and this is where the Kingmaker's story becomes a cautionary tale about what happens when you mistake compliance for loyalty. Let me give you a specific example of how Warwick operated. In 1460, after the Yorkists had won a major battle at Northampton, they captured King Henry VI. Now you would think this would be the end of it. They had the king, game over, right? But Warwick understood something subtle about medieval politics. It is not enough to have power. People have to accept that you have power. So instead of declaring Edward king immediately, Warwick kept Henry alive as a puppet monarch while he negotiated with Parliament to recognise York's right to the succession. And during one of those negotiations, something incredible happened. Warwick ordered the massacre of Lancastrian prisoners after the Battle of Northampton. The chronicles specifically mention that Warwick gave the command, not Richard of York. Why? Because Warwick wanted to make it clear that he was in charge, that even the Duke of York followed his lead when it came to military decisions. Think about the psychology of that for a second. Warwick was using violence not just to win battles, but to establish dominance within his own faction. He was saying, I am the one who makes the hard choices. I am the one with the stomach for what needs to be done. And for a while it worked. Everyone deferred to Warwick. Even Richard of York, the man who should have been giving orders, let Warwick run the show. But Edward was not his father. Edward had grown up watching Warwick manipulate people, and he had learned the game too well. When Edward became the leader of the Yorkist cause in 1461, he let Warwick think he was still in control. He took Warwick's advice, gave him honours and titles, made all the right noises about gratitude and respect. And all the while, Edward was quietly building his own power base, making his own alliances, preparing for the moment when he would not need the Kingmaker anymore. And that moment came faster than anyone expected. But before we get there, I want you to understand what was going through Warwick's mind during these years. He had spent a decade building this perfect political machine. He had made kings and broken them. He had turned the York family from desperate rebels into the rulers of England, and he'd done it all with one goal in mind: securing his daughter's future. By 1464, Warwick had a plan. Edward was now King Edward IV, young and unmarried. Warwick would negotiate a marriage between Edward and a French princess, specifically Bona of Savoy, sister-in-law to the French king. This marriage would bring a powerful alliance with France, stabilise England's international position, and most importantly, it would make Warwick the architect of England's foreign policy. And once that was settled, Warwick could marry his own daughters into the extended royal family, securing the Neville legacy for generations. It was a brilliant plan. Warwick even travelled to France personally to negotiate the marriage. He met with the French king, discussed terms, got agreements to principle. By all accounts, the deal was almost done. Warwick was probably already planning the wedding feast. Remember, this is a man who once fed 30,000 people at a party. He was going to make this the event of the century. And then Edward sent him a letter. The king had gotten married, in secret, to an English commoner, without telling Warwick, without asking permission, without even bothering to mention that he was already negotiating a completely different marriage. Can you imagine receiving that letter? Warwick is in France making promises to the French king on behalf of Edward, and Edward has just made him look like a complete fool. Every agreement Warwick made is now worthless. His reputation, the thing he had built his entire career on, is in tatters. And perhaps worst of all, Edward did not even have the courtesy to be apologetic about it. This is the moment when everything changed. This is when the Kingmaker realised that he had created a monster he could not control. Edward was not going to be a puppet king. He was not going to let Warwick marry off his daughters to secure their future. Edward was going to do whatever he wanted, and Warwick would just have to live with it. But Warwick did not know how to live with it. His entire identity was built around being the indispensable man, the one everyone needed. And now Edward was proving that he did not need Warwick at all. In fact, Edward was actively working to sideline him, to replace Warwick's allies at court with people loyal to the new queen and her family. And this is where Warwick made the decision that would define the rest of his life and plunge England into even deeper chaos. If Edward would not let him be the power behind the throne, then Warwick would find a different throne, a different king, a different dynasty, even if that meant betraying everything he had fought for, even if it meant allying with his bitterest enemies, even if it meant putting his own daughters in danger. Because here is the terrible truth about the Kingmaker: he would rather burn down the kingdom than accept that he was not the one in control. And England was about to learn that a desperate, humiliated, infinitely resourceful man with armies at his command is the most dangerous force in politics. The game was about to change. The White Rose and the Red Rose were about to do something nobody thought possible. And Warwick's daughters, those chess pieces he had moved so carefully across the board, were about to become queens in a game that would cost them everything. But first, we need to go back to 1460 and talk about what happened to Richard of York. Because that tragedy, that brutal, heartbreaking disaster, is what created the circumstances that allowed Warwick to rise to such heights, and it is what haunted Edward IV for the rest of his life. Sometimes the cruelest moments in history happen right when victory seems certain, right when you think you have finally won, when the throne you have fought for is almost within reach. Fate reaches out and destroys everything in a single afternoon. December 30th, 1460, the Battle of Wakefield. This is the day when Richard, Duke of York, the man who should have been king, the man with the strongest legal claim to the English throne, made one catastrophic mistake that cost him his life, humiliated his family, and turned him into a legend that his sons would spend the next 25 years avenging. And the worst part? It did not have to happen. York was winning. The agreement was already signed. All he had to do was wait. Let me take you back to October of 1460, just 2 months before Wakefield. Richard of York has just returned from Ireland, where he'd been essentially hiding out after some military setbacks. But this time things are different. He has gathered his forces, allied with Warwick and the Neville family, and marched on London with an army. And when he arrives at Parliament, he does something audacious, something that shocks everyone present. He walks straight to the throne and puts his hand on it, as if to say, "This belongs to me." The silence in that room must have been deafening, because up until this moment, York had always maintained the fiction that he was just trying to help poor, mad King Henry govern better. He had never openly claimed the throne, but now, standing there with his hand on the royal seat, he was making his intentions crystal clear. After years of political dancing, after pretending he just wanted to be Lord Protector, York was finally admitting what everyone already knew. He thought he should be king. The nobles in Parliament did not know what to do. On one hand, they could not deny that York had a legitimate claim through his descent from Lionel of Clarence. On the other hand, Henry VI was right there, still technically king, and declaring York the rightful monarch would mean admitting that the Lancastrian dynasty had been illegitimate for 60 years. That is a hard pill to swallow when half the nobility has built their careers on Lancastrian favour. So they came up with a compromise. The Act of Accord, they called it. Here is what it said. Henry VI could remain king for the rest of his natural life. But when he died, the throne would pass to Richard of York and his heirs, not to Henry's son Edward of Lancaster. The Lancastrian line was effectively disinherited, but Henry got to keep wearing the crown until death took it from him, naturally. York agreed. After decades of fighting, after all the battles and political manoeuvring, he had won. Not perfectly, not immediately, but he had won. All he had to do now was wait for Henry to die, and given Henry's poor health, that might not take very long. York was 49 years old. He could afford to be patient, except he could not, because someone else had not agreed to the Act of Accord, someone who had no intention of letting her son be disinherited, someone who was, at that very moment, gathering an army in the north, Margaret of Anjou, the she-wolf of France, and she was coming for York's head. Now, I want you to understand the military situation in late 1460. York's forces were split. Warwick was in London with the main army protecting the king and the government. York himself had gone north to his castle at Sandal near the town of Wakefield in Yorkshire, with a much smaller force, probably around 5,000 men. His plan was to spend Christmas there, rest his troops and wait for reinforcements. But Margaret was not going to wait. She had assembled a Lancastrian army of somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 men. The chronicles are not precise, but everyone agrees that Margaret's force vastly outnumbered York's, and she positioned that army near Wakefield, just a few miles from York's castle, daring him to come out and fight. This is where the story gets murky, and historians have argued for centuries about what actually happened next. What we know for certain is this. On December 30th, 1460, Richard of York left the safety of Sandal Castle and marched his small army out to engage Margaret's forces. What we do not know for certain is why. Some historians think York was lured out by a trick. The story goes that the Lancastrians sent a small foraging party near the castle, making it look like an easy target. York, seeing what he thought was a chance to capture supplies and win a small victory, took the bait. He led his men out, and only then did he realize that the small party was bait for a massive ambush. Other historians think York simply made a tactical blunder. Maybe he underestimated Margaret's numbers. Maybe he overestimated his own forces. Maybe he just got impatient and wanted to strike before Margaret's army could grow even larger. Medieval commanders did not have satellites or reconnaissance drones. They relied on scouts and spies, and that intelligence was often incomplete or just plain wrong. But there is a third theory, and it is the most heartbreaking one. Some chronicles suggest that York went out to battle because his son Edmund was already in the field. Edmund, who was only 17 years old, had been sent out with a small force and was now in danger of being overwhelmed. And York, being a father, could not just sit in his castle while his son fought and died, so he rode out to save him. We will never know which version is true. Maybe it is a combination of all three. But what we do know is that Richard of York, the man who was finally legally officially next in line to the throne, rode out of Sandal Castle on a cold December morning and straight into a slaughter. The Battle of Wakefield did not last long. How could it? York had maybe 5,000 men. Margaret had 4 times that many. The Yorkist forces were surrounded, overwhelmed, cut to pieces. Medieval battles could go either way when the numbers were close, but when one side has a 4-to-1 advantage, the outcome is basically predetermined. Richard of York fought bravely. The chronicles all agree on that. He did not run, did not surrender, did not beg for mercy. He fought until he could not fight anymore, and then, somewhere in the chaos and blood and screaming, the Duke of York was cut down. The man who should have been king died in the mud of a Yorkshire battlefield, his dream of the throne dying with him. But that was not the end of his humiliation, not even close. Here is where the story becomes so dark, so deliberately cruel that it haunts English history to this day. After the battle, the Lancastrian soldiers found York's body. They cut off his head, standard practice for traitors in medieval England. But then someone, and we will never know who gave the order, decided that beheading York was not enough. They wanted to make a statement. They wanted to humiliate the York family so thoroughly that they would never dare challenge the Lancastrians again. So they took York's severed head and placed a paper crown on it, a mock crown to ridicule his claim to the throne, and then they stuck his head on a spike and mounted it on the Micklegate Bar, one of the main gates into the city of York. The symbolism was deliberate and vicious. The Duke of York, displayed on the gate of his own city, wearing a paper crown, a permanent reminder of how close he came to glory and how far he fell. The chronicler Edward Hall, writing decades later, describes the scene. His head was set upon the gates of York, garnished with a crown of paper. Just think about that image for a moment. The man who had literally put his hand on the throne of England, reduced to a grotesque decoration, mocked in death the way he had never been mocked in life. But they did not stop with Richard. His 17-year-old son Edmund, Earl of Rutland, was also killed at Wakefield. The circumstances of Edmund's death are disputed. Some chronicles say he died in battle, fighting alongside his father, but others tell a much darker story. According to this version, Edmund survived the initial battle and tried to flee. He made it to Wakefield Bridge, where he was caught by a Lancastrian lord named John Clifford. Edmund, seeing Clifford, begged for mercy. He was just a teenager, he said. He was not a threat. Please let him live. And Clifford, according to the chronicle, said something chilling. Your father killed mine, now I will kill you, because Clifford's father had died at the First Battle of St. Albans, fighting for the Lancastrians, and Clifford had spent 5 years waiting for revenge, so he killed Edmund, personally, a grown man murdering a teenage boy in cold blood and calling it justice. Then they put Edmund's head on a spike too, right next to his father's. 2 generations of the York family, displayed like trophies on the gates of their own city. Now, can you imagine being Edward, the eldest York son, when news of Wakefield reached him? Your father is dead. Your teenage brother is dead. Their heads are being mocked on spikes. The entire north of England is celebrating the destruction of your family. and you are 19 years old, suddenly thrust into leadership of a cause that just suffered its worst defeat. What would you do? Would you surrender? Would you flee the country and accept that the Lancastrian claim was too strong to fight? Would you negotiate some kind of peace, trading your claim to the throne for safety in exile? Edward did none of those things. Instead, he did something that changed the course of English history. He turned his grief into rage, his humiliation into determination, and within 3 months, he would win a battle so brutal, so decisive, so soaked in blood that England would never be the same. But let us stay with Wakefield for another moment, because I want you to understand what this defeat meant for the York family. This was not just a military loss, it was a psychological wound that would never fully heal. Cecily Neville, York's widow, had to live knowing her husband and son were being mocked in death. She had to explain to her other children that their father was gone, their brother was gone, and their enemies were celebrating. And the younger sons, George, who was about 11, and Richard, who was only 8, had to grow up knowing that their family name was literally being ridiculed on a city gate. Is it any wonder that Richard would grow up to be one of the most controversial figures in English history? Is it any wonder that these boys would become men who showed no mercy to their enemies? The tragedy of Wakefield is not just what happened on December 30th, 1460, it is what that day created. It created a generation of Yorkists who would never forgive, never forget, never stop fighting until every last Lancastrian was destroyed. It turned a political dispute into a blood feud. It made compromise impossible. And here is what breaks my heart about the whole thing. Richard of York had won. The Act of Accord had given him everything he wanted without more bloodshed. All he had to do was wait, but he went out to battle anyway, either because he was tricked, or because he made a mistake, or because he was trying to save his Tsar, and that one decision cost him his life, his legacy, and England another decade of war. There is a lesson here about patience, about knowing when you have won even if it does not feel like winning. York had achieved his political goal. The throne was promised to his line, but that was not enough for him. Maybe he wanted vindication in battle. Maybe he wanted to crush the Lancastrians completely. Maybe he was just tired of waiting and wanted to settle things once and for all. Whatever his reasons, they died with him in the mud at Wakefield, and his severed head, crowned in paper mockery, became the most powerful recruitment tool the Yorkists ever had. Because nothing motivates an army quite like the image of your leader being humiliated in death. Margaret of Anjou thought she had won at Wakefield. She thought that by killing York and displaying his head, she had crushed the Yorkist cause. She could not have been more wrong. What she had actually done was create a martyr. She had given the Yorkists a symbol of Lancastrian cruelty that they would invoke for the next 25 years. Every time a Yorkist soldier went into a battle, he could think of that paper crown and fight harder. And Edward, that 19-year-old who had just lost his father and brother, was about to prove that he had inherited more than just a claim to the throne. He had inherited the white rose, and he was going to make sure that rose bloomed over the corpses of everyone who had mocked his father's memory. The vengeance was coming, swift, brutal, and more terrible than anyone could imagine. Because in 2 months, at a place called Towton, England was about to experience the bloodiest day in its entire history. A day when 28,000 men would die in the snow. A day when the white rose would prove that it could bloom in winter, fertilized by blood. And Margaret of Anjou, standing at Wakefield thinking she had won, had no idea what she had just unleashed. Picture this. It is Palm Sunday, March 29th, 1461. Snow is falling on a field in Yorkshire. 50,000 men are about to fight in a battle that will last 10 hours. And by sunset, 28,000 of them will be dead. That is more casualties than the first day of the Battle of the Somme in World War I. More than Gettysburg, more than Waterloo. In fact, If you calculate deaths as a percentage of the population, Towton is the bloodiest battle ever fought on British soil. 1% of the entire population of England died in a single day. Let me say that again so it sinks in. 1 out of every 100 people in England was killed at Towton. Imagine if that happened today in the United States. That would be 3 million people dead in one afternoon. And this was not some distant colonial war or foreign invasion. This was Englishmen killing Englishmen, neighbour against neighbour, in a field that would run red with so much blood that the nearby rivercock literally changed colour. And it all happened because a 19-year-old wanted revenge for his father's death. 2 months have passed since Wakefield. 2 months since Richard of York had his head stuck on a pike with a paper crown. 2 months since young Edward lost his father and brother in the most humiliating way possible. And in those 2 months, Edward has transformed from a grieving teenager into something terrifying, a man with nothing left to lose and an army ready to follow him into hell. But before we get to Towton itself, we need to talk about what happened in those 2 months, because Edward's journey to that snow-covered battlefield is a story of near miraculous survival and tactical brilliance that proved he was not just Richard of York's son, he was something more dangerous. After Wakefield, Margaret of Anjou did not rest. She marched her victorious army south toward London, pillaging and burning as she went. The chronicles describe her army as a terrifying force of northerners, Scottish mercenaries, Welsh soldiers and Lancastrian loyalists who had been promised they could loot any town they captured. It was less a professional army and more a barely controlled mob. And Edward, meanwhile, was in the Welsh marches, the borderlands between England and Wales, trying desperately to raise an army of his own. He was so young, 19 years old, and suddenly responsible for avenging his father, protecting what remained of his family, and somehow defeating an enemy that had just won the greatest victory of the war. On February 2nd, 1461, Edward fought his first battle as the leader of the Yorkist cause. The Battle of Mortimer's Cross, they call it, and this is where Edward showed the world that he had inherited something special from his father, not just a claim to the throne, but an ability to inspire men in the darkest moments. The chronicles say that before the Battle of Mortimer's Cross, there was a phenomenon called a parhelion, a sundog, where it looks like there are 3 suns in the sky due to ice crystals in the atmosphere. Edward's soldiers saw this and panicked, thinking it was a bad omen. But Edward, with the quick thinking that would define his reign, reinterpreted it on the spot. He told his men that the 3 suns represented the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and that God was showing them favour. He even adopted 3 suns as his personal symbol after that. Brilliant, right? Take a moment of potential disaster and turn it into a rallying cry. That is political genius. And it worked. Edward won at Mortimer's Cross, securing Wales and giving the Yorkist cause hope when it desperately needed it. But while Edward was winning in Wales, things were going very badly in the south. Margaret's army was approaching London, and Warwick rode out to stop her with the main Yorkist force. They met at the Second Battle of St Albans on February 17th, and this time the Lancastrians won decisively. Warwick lost. Even worse, the Lancastrians recaptured King Henry VI, who had been Warwick's prisoner. So now the situation was this. Margaret had the king. She had just won a major battle. Her army was enormous, and she was camped outside London, ready to take the capital and end the Yorkist rebellion once and for all. But then something unexpected happened. The citizens of London refused to open the gates. They had heard stories about Margaret's army, the looting, the burning, the Scottish mercenaries who did not care about English law or property. The Lord Mayor sent word to Margaret, "Your army is not welcome here. You can have your victory, but you cannot have our city." and Margaret fatally decided not to force the issue. Maybe she thought a siege would take too long. Maybe she worried about keeping her unruly army under control in hostile territory. Maybe she just made a mistake. But for whatever reason, she withdrew her army north and waited for Edward to come to her. It was the worst decision she ever made, because by retreating she gave Edward time to march from Wales to London, time to rally more supporters, time to do something audacious that would change the entire dynamic of the war. On March 4th, 1461, Edward entered London. The city welcomed him as a liberator, and on that same day he did what his father had never quite dared to do. He declared himself king, not heir to the throne, not Lord Protector. King Edward IV. He was 19 years old, his father had been dead for barely 2 months, and he had just claimed the throne of England based on nothing but military victory and popular support, the Act of Accord, that careful legal compromise that said the throne would pass to the York family after Henry died. Edward basically tore it up and said, "I am taking the throne now, and if anyone has a problem with that, they can meet me on the battlefield." It was bold, reckless even, but it worked, because Edward understood something that his father never quite grasped. In a civil war, legal niceties matter less than military facts. And the military fact was that Edward controlled London, had a growing army, and looked every inch a king. Contemporary chronicles describe Edward as extraordinarily handsome and charismatic. He was well over 6 feet tall, a giant by medieval standards, with golden hair and a smile that made people want to follow him. One chronicler wrote that he was the handsomest prince in Christendom. Another said that nature could not have produced a more beautiful form. This might sound superficial, but in medieval politics appearance mattered. A king needed to look the part, and Edward looked like every fairy tale prince come to life. But he was about to prove that underneath that pretty face was a mind capable of calculated brutality that would have made his father proud and horrified at the same time. After declaring himself king, Edward immediately began marching north to confront Margaret's army. And as he marched, he sent out orders to his commanders, orders that historians still debate today because of how savage they were. Edward commanded that after the coming battle, there would be no mercy for common soldiers. Usually, medieval battles ended with the nobility taking prisoners for ransom and the common soldiers being allowed to flee or surrender. But Edward ordered that this time everyone who fought for the Lancastrians would die. No prisoners, no ransoms, no mercy. Why? Because Edward understood that this had to be the final battle. He could not afford a long, drawn-out war. He needed to break the Lancastrian cause so completely that it could never threaten him again. And that meant killing not just the leaders, but destroying their entire army. The two forces finally met near the village of Towton on March 28th. It was the day before Palm Sunday. Snow was falling, this was late March, but it was what historians call the Little Ice Age, a period when European winters were especially brutal. The temperature was below freezing, the wind was howling, and approximately 50,000 men were preparing to kill each other. 50,000. Think about that number for a moment. Most medieval battles involved maybe 5,000 to 10,000 men total. Towton had 50,000. It was the largest battle ever fought on English soil, and it remained so to this day. Every able-bodied man in northern England seemed to be there, forced to choose a side, forced to fight. And then, at dawn on March 29th, the killing began. The Battle of Towton started with an archery duel, which was standard for medieval English battles. Both sides had thousands of archers, and they began firing volleys at each other across the field. But here is where the weather became a factor. The wind and snow were blowing from south to north, from the Yorkist positions toward the Lancastrians. which meant that Yorkist arrows flew farther and struck harder, while Lancastrian arrows fell short or were slowed by the headwind. The Yorkist commander, a man named Lord Falkenberg, realised this and ordered his archers to fire one massive volley, then retreat. The Lancastrian archers, unable to see clearly through the snow, fired back at where they thought the Yorkists were. But the Yorkists had pulled back, and the Lancastrian arrows struck nothing but empty ground. Then the Yorkists moved forward, picked up the fallen Lancastrian arrows, and fired them back. They were literally using their enemy's ammunition against them. After the archery phase, the two armies clashed in hand-to-hand combat, and this is where Towton became a slaughter. The fighting was so intense, so sustained, that it lasted for 10 straight hours. 10 hours of sword against sword, axe against shield, men screaming and dying in the snow. There was no real strategy at this point, no clever tactics, just two massive armies grinding each other down through sheer attrition. Contemporary accounts describe scenes that sound more like a horror movie than a medieval battle. Men slipping on the blood-soaked ground, bodies piling so high that they formed obstacles that fighters had to climb over. The snow turning red, then pink, then red again, as more blood soaked into it. The nearby river Cock filling with corpses until you could supposedly walk across it on the bodies. And through it all, Edward was there, fighting at the front. He did not command from the rear like many medieval kings. He was in the thick of it, his armour covered in blood, rallying his men whenever they started to waver. Because that is what Edward understood that his father did not. You cannot inspire men from the safety of a castle. You have to be willing to die alongside them. By mid-afternoon, the battle was still undecided. Both sides were exhausted, bleeding, running out of men. And then, just when it seemed like the fighting might end in a stalemate, reinforcements arrived. But not for Margaret, for Edward. The Duke of Norfolk showed up with several thousand fresh troops, and they slammed into the Lancastrian flank. That was the moment the battle turned. The Lancastrian line, which had held for hours, finally broke. And when it broke, the killing went from terrible to apocalyptic, because Edward's orders were clear: no mercy, no prisoners, hunt them down and kill them all. The Lancastrian soldiers ran. They ran south toward the river Cock, hoping to cross it and escape. But the river was swollen with snowmelt, and hundreds of men drowned trying to cross it. Others made it to the far bank, only to be caught by Yorkist cavalry and cut down. The chronicles describe a pursuit that lasted for miles, with Yorkist soldiers killing fleeing Lancastrians all through the night. Contemporary sources estimate that 28,000 men died at Towton. Modern historians think that number might be slightly exaggerated, but even if it is, we are still talking about somewhere between 20,000 and 28,000 deaths in a single day. That is unfathomable carnage. And here is what makes it even more tragic. Most of the dead were not nobles or professional soldiers. They were ordinary men, farmers, craftsmen, merchants who had been forced to choose a side and fight. Men who probably did not care whether a white rose or a red rose sat on the throne, but who died anyway because two families could not settle their disputes peacefully. Archaeological excavations at Towton in the 1990s found a mass grave with the remains of 38 men. Forensic analysis of their bones revealed horrific injuries: skulls split by axes, faces mutilated by blades, defensive wounds on their arms where they had tried to protect themselves. One skull had 9 separate injuries. Another had been hit so hard that the blade went straight through the bone. These were not clean, quick deaths. These were men who died in agony, hacked to pieces by people who were probably their neighbours. After Towton, Edward was undisputed King of England. Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou fled north to Scotland, broken and defeated. The Lancastrian cause was shattered. The White Rose had won through sheer overwhelming violence. But victory at such a cost changes you. Edward was 19 when he rode into Towton. He was 20 when he rode out, and he was not the same person. How could he be? He had ordered the deaths of tens of thousands of men. He had seen the snow turn red with English blood. He had won his father's throne, yes, but the price was a field full of corpses and a kingdom traumatized by the worst violence it had ever experienced. The question hanging over England after Towton was simple. Was it worth it? Was the throne worth 28,000 lives? Was the White Rose worth drowning in that much blood? Edward thought it was, and for the next 12 years he would try to build a kingdom out of the ashes of Towton, but the ghosts of that bloody field would haunt every decision he made. Because when you start your reign by killing such a large portion of your own population, how do you ever convince them to trust you? How do you turn soldiers back into farmers, warriors back into neighbours, and most importantly, how do you prevent the families of those 28,000 dead men from wanting revenge? Because that is the terrible arithmetic of civil war. Every death creates orphans and widows who remember. Every battlefield becomes a source of future hatred. Every victory plants the seeds of the next rebellion. Edward had won at Towton, but the Wars of the Roses were far from over. In fact, in many ways, they were just beginning, because now Edward had to deal with something more complicated than military enemies. He had to deal with Warwick, the kingmaker, who thought he had just put a puppet on the throne. He had to deal with Margaret of Anjou, who was even now plotting her return. And he had to deal with his own heart, which was about to make a decision so reckless, so politically disastrous, that it would undo everything Towton had achieved. But that is a story about love, ambition, and the deadliest woman Edward would ever meet, a commoner with Lancastrian blood who would become his queen, and the mother of two princes whose fates would haunt England for centuries. Every kingdom needs a fairy tale. Every king needs a love story that makes the people believe in romance and destiny. And Edward IV definitely got his fairy tale. A beautiful widow standing under an oak tree, asking the king for help, and the king falling so completely in love that he married her in secret. It is the kind of story that should have a happy ending, with songs and celebrations and everyone living happily ever after. Except this is not a fairy tale. This is politics. And in medieval politics, marrying for love instead of strategic advantage is not romantic, it is catastrophic. Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville created a scandal that rocked England to its foundations, destroyed his relationship with his most powerful ally, and planted the seeds of a tragedy that would eventually consume his entire family. And the wildest part, Elizabeth was not even supposed to be anywhere near the throne. She was a Lancastrian widow with 2 children and barely enough money to keep her estate running. She should have been invisible. Instead, she became the most controversial queen in English history. And depending on who you ask, she was either a victim of vicious propaganda or a manipulative witch who seduced a king and destroyed a kingdom. Truth, as always, is more complicated and far more interesting. Let me take you back to 1464. 3 years have passed since Towton. Edward is now in his early 20s, tall, handsome, charming, and universally beloved by the people of London. He has stabilised his kingdom, pushed the Lancastrians into exile, and is generally doing a decent job of being king. But there is one problem. He needs to get married. In medieval monarchy, a king without an heir is a kingdom waiting for a civil war. Everyone is watching Edward, waiting for him to choose a bride. and Warwick, the kingmaker, already has the perfect candidate picked out. Bona of Savoy, sister-in-law to the King of France. This marriage would bring a powerful alliance with France, stabilise England's international position, and most importantly, it would cement Warwick's role as the architect of English foreign policy. Warwick is so confident in this plan that he travels to France personally to negotiate the marriage. He meets with King Louis XI, discusses dowries and treaties, and by all accounts the deal is basically done. Warwick is probably already imagining the wedding feast. Remember, this is a man who fed 30,000 people at a party once. He is going to make this the diplomatic event of the decade. And while Warwick is in France doing all this careful negotiating, Edward is in England falling in love with a woman who is the exact opposite of everything a royal bride should be. Elizabeth Woodville. Let me tell you about her, because she is one of the most misunderstood women in English history. She was born around 1437, which made her about 5 years older than Edward. Not a huge gap, but definitely unusual. Medieval kings typically married younger women, often teenagers, because youth was associated with fertility and malleability. Elizabeth was neither young nor malleable. She was the daughter of Richard Woodville and Jacquetta of Luxembourg. Now, the Woodville family was respectable enough, minor nobility, landed gentry, but they were not important. And here is the really problematic part. Elizabeth had been married before to a Lancastrian knight named John Grey, who died fighting against the Yorkists at the Second Battle of St. Albans. So Elizabeth was not just a commoner by royal standards, she was a Lancastrian widow. Her first husband literally died fighting against Edward's forces, and she had 2 sons from that first marriage, Thomas and Richard Grey. Medieval kings did not marry widows with children. It was complicated, messy, and created succession issues. If Edward married Elizabeth, these Lancastrian boys would become the king's stepsons, with all the political complications that entailed. So by every political calculation, Elizabeth Woodville was the worst possible choice for queen, and Edward married her anyway. The story of how they met has been told and retold so many times that it has taken on mythic qualities. The most popular version goes like this. Elizabeth was living at her late husband's estate, struggling financially because the Yorkist government had confiscated some of her lands as punishment for her husband's Lancastrian loyalties. She heard that King Edward was hunting in the nearby forest, so she stationed herself under an oak tree, the Grafton Oak as it is now known, with her 2 young sons, hoping to petition the king for the return of her property. Edward saw her and was immediately smitten. The chronicles describe Elizabeth as extraordinarily beautiful, with long blonde hair and remarkable poise. But she was also smart enough to know that simply being beautiful was not enough. When Edward made advances toward her, and let us be clear, medieval kings expected sexual favours from attractive women in their court. Elizabeth refused, not gently either. According to some accounts, when Edward tried to seduce her, Elizabeth held a knife to her own throat and said she would rather die than dishonour herself. Now, was this genuine virtue or calculated strategy? We will never know. Maybe Elizabeth really was protecting her honour, or maybe she understood something that most women of her era did not. A king can have any number of mistresses, but he only gets one queen, and by refusing to be Edward's mistress, she was forcing him to make a choice. Leave her alone, or marry her. Edward chose marriage, in absolute secret, without telling his council, without informing Warwick, without any of the pageantry and political manoeuvring that usually accompanied royal weddings. Edward married Elizabeth Woodville on May 1st, 1464. The ceremony took place at dawn in a small chapel with only a handful of witnesses. It was so secret that even Edward's own mother did not know about it. And for 5 months Edward kept the marriage hidden. 5 months where he let Warwick continue negotiating the French marriage. 5 months where he pretended to still be considering his options. Can you imagine how Warwick must have felt when he finally found out? He is in France making promises to the French king on behalf of Edward, and the entire time Edward is already married to someone else. The humiliation was total and complete. But why did Edward keep it secret for so long? Some historians think he was genuinely conflicted. He knew the marriage was politically disastrous, but he could not bring himself to annul it. Others think he was just a 22-year-old man who had gotten in over his head and did not know how to fix it. And some think it was a deliberate power play, Edward's way of asserting independence from Warwick's control. Whatever the reason, when Edward finally announced the marriage in September of 1464, the reaction was explosive. The nobles were shocked. The common people were delighted. They loved a good romance story. And Warwick was absolutely, furiously, devastatingly betrayed. Because this was not just about the marriage. This was about power. Warwick had spent years building Edward's kingdom, winning his battles, making his alliances, and now Edward was basically saying, "Thanks for all that, but I am going to make decisions on my own now." The French marriage would have kept Warwick as the indispensable diplomat. Elizabeth Woodville made him obsolete. And then things got worse, because Elizabeth was not content to just be queen. She wanted power and position for her entire family, and she had a very large family. Elizabeth had 7 siblings, 5 brothers and 2 sisters, plus her 2 sons from her first marriage, and all of them needed titles, lands, and advantageous marriages. So Edward started handing out positions to the Woodville family like candy. Elizabeth's father was made Earl Rivers and Treasurer of England. Her brother Anthony became one of Edward's closest advisors. Her sisters were married off to the wealthiest noblemen in England. And the most controversial move of all, Elizabeth's 20-year-old brother John was married to Catherine Neville, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, who was in her 60s. A 20-year-old man marrying a woman in her 60s for her wealth and title. People were scandalized. The established nobility, the families who had fought for Edward at Towton and supported the Yorkist cause from the beginning, watched all of this and seethed with resentment. These upstart Woodvilles were taking positions and marriages that should have gone to loyal Yorkist families. And the fact that Elizabeth was Lancastrian by background made it even worse. People started whispering that maybe Edward had been bewitched. Maybe Elizabeth and her mother Jacquetta had used witchcraft to ensnare the king. The witchcraft accusations are fascinating because they reveal so much about medieval attitudes toward women and power. When a beautiful woman marries above her station, it cannot possibly be because the man genuinely loves her. It must be magic. When a commoner becomes queen, it cannot be political skill, it must be sorcery. In 1469, formal charges of witchcraft were actually brought against Elizabeth and Jacquetta. The charges did not stick, there was no evidence, but the fact that they were brought at all shows how much resentment the Woodville family had generated. And here is the thing that drives me crazy about how history remembers Elizabeth. She is always portrayed as either a scheming seductress or a witch or a gold digger. But what was she supposed to do? She was a widow with 2 children and limited resources. She had the incredible good fortune to catch a king's eye. Was she supposed to say no? Was she supposed to turn down the opportunity to secure her children's future and elevate her family from minor gentry to the highest ranks of nobility? Think about it from her perspective for a moment. She is living in a world where women have almost no economic or political power. Her first husband died fighting in a war she probably did not care about. The Yorkist government confiscated her lands, leaving her struggling to support her children. And then the most powerful man in England falls in love with her and offers marriage. Would you have said no? I would not have. But by accepting Edward's proposal, Elizabeth made herself a target. Every political enemy Edward had, every noble who felt slighted by the Woodville family's rise, every person who thought the king should have made a diplomatic marriage, they all blamed Elizabeth. And when things started to go wrong in Edward's reign, as they inevitably would, Elizabeth was the perfect scapegoat. There is a moment in 1468 that captures the impossible position Elizabeth was in. Edward's mother, Slee Neville, the Duchess of York, was furious about her son's marriage. According to some chronicles, Slee actually claimed that Edward was illegitimate, that he was not really her late husband's son, in an attempt to delegitimize the marriage. Her own mother essentially called her son a bastard because she was so opposed to his choice of bride. Can you imagine the family dynamics there? Elizabeth is trying to be queen, trying to support her husband, and her mother-in-law is literally claiming that the king is not legitimate. But through all of this, through the scandals and the witchcraft accusations and the political fallout, Edward and Elizabeth seem to have genuinely loved each other. They had 10 children together over the course of their marriage. 10. That is not the mark of a political marriage of convenience. That is 2 people who actually enjoyed each other's company. Their eldest daughter, also named Elizabeth, would eventually become one of the most important women in English history. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. What I want you to understand is that Elizabeth Woodville was not some passive pawn or evil seductress. She was a woman trying to survive and thrive in a brutally difficult environment. Yes, she promoted her family aggressively, but in a world where family connections were everything, where your survival often depended on having powerful relatives, can you really blame her? The tragedy is that Elizabeth's rise created the political divisions that would eventually destroy her family. By alienating Warwick, by creating resentment among the old Yorkist nobility, Elizabeth inadvertently set in motion a chain of events that would lead to more war, more betrayal, and eventually the disappearance of her own sons under circumstances that still haunt historians today. But in 1464, standing under that oak tree, falling in love with a king, Elizabeth could not have known any of that. She was just a widow trying to get her lands back. And Edward was just a young king who saw a beautiful woman and thought, for once in his life he could make a decision based on his heart instead of political calculation. They were both wrong, because in the world of medieval monarchy, there is no such thing as a private decision. Every choice a king makes becomes a political act. Every marriage is a treaty. Every child is a potential heir or a threat. Edward thought he could have both, a love match and a stable kingdom. What he got instead was 15 years of relative peace followed by a catastrophe that would end his dynasty and create one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. But before we get to that tragedy, before we talk about what happened to Elizabeth's sons and the darkness that would eventually consume the White Rose from within, we need to understand what happened when Warwick decided he had had enough. When the kingmaker, humiliated and sidelined, decided that if Edward would not listen to him, then maybe Edward should not be king at all. Because the next chapter of this story is about betrayal on a scale that would shock even this blood-soaked era. It is about a man so powerful he thought he could unmake kings as easily as he made them. And it is about 2 brothers, Edward and George, whose relationship was about to be tested in ways that would end in one of the strangest deaths in English history. The Woodville marriage broke England's fragile peace, and what came next would prove that the Wars of the Roses were far from over. Have you ever had a friend betray you so completely that it changed who you are as a person? Now imagine that friend is the most powerful nobleman in your kingdom, and his betrayal does not just hurt your feelings, it costs you your throne. That is what happened to Edward IV between 1469 and 1471. and the wildest part. The betrayal was not just from Warwick, the man who had made Edward king, it also came from Edward's own brother, his blood, the person who should have been his most loyal supporter. This is a story about what happens when pride, ambition, and resentment collide. When a man who thought he was indispensable discovers he is not. When a brother decides that maybe he should be king instead. And when the most ruthless queen in England sees an opportunity to take back everything she lost. Welcome to the most complicated, backstabbing, absolutely insane 3 years of the Wars of the Roses, where alliances shift so fast you need a flowchart to keep track, where yesterday's enemies become today's allies, become tomorrow's corpses, where a king gets deposed, restored, deposed again, and finally kills or imprisons almost everyone who betrayed him. And it all starts with Warwick staring at Edward across a council table and realizing that the young king he created is never, ever going to do what Warwick wants again. We are in 1469 now. 5 years have passed since Edward's secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville. 5 years of watching the Woodville family accumulate power and wealth while Warwick gets sidelined. 5 years of Edward making decisions without consulting the man who won him the throne. And Warwick has finally had enough. But Warwick is too smart to just openly rebel. He is not going to march an army to London and announce that he is overthrowing the king. That would make him a traitor, and traitors get their heads stuck on pikes. Instead, Warwick does something much more clever and much more devastating. He recruits Edward's brother George to be the figurehead of a rebellion that will make Edward dependent on Warwick again. George, Duke of Clarence. Let me tell you about this man, because he's one of the most fascinating train wrecks in medieval history. George was born in 1449, which makes him about 11 years younger than Edward. He grew up in the shadow of his brilliant, charismatic older brother, watching Edward become king, win battles, and capture the hearts of the English people. And George, by all accounts, was jealous. Now, jealousy between brothers is nothing new. But when one brother is the King of England and the other is just a duke, that jealousy becomes dangerous. George was handsome like Edward, but not quite as handsome. He was tall, but not quite as tall. He was charming, but not quite as charismatic. He was everything Edward was, just slightly less, and that slightly less ate at him every single day. The chronicles describe George as weak-willed, easily influenced, and prone to making terrible decisions. One historian called him of no great intelligence. But what George lacked in wisdom, he made up for in ambition and spite, and Warwick, watching George sulk at court, saw an opportunity. Here is how Warwick pitched it to George. You are the second son of York. If something happens to Edward, and who knows, accidents occur, you would be king, but the Woodville family is propping up Edward, keeping him strong. If we remove the Woodvilles from power, if we force Edward to govern properly with proper advisors like me, then you will be in a much better position. And by the way, how would you like to marry my daughter Isabel, the wealthiest heiress in England? George said yes, because of course he did. He got to marry into Warwick's massive fortune, position himself as heir to the throne, and get revenge on the Woodville family that he resented. It was everything George wanted, and all he had to do was betray his own brother. In July of 1469, George and Warwick travelled to Calais, the English-controlled port city in France, and George married Isabel Neville in direct defiance of Edward's wishes. Edward had forbidden the marriage because he knew exactly what it meant. George and Warwick were forming an alliance against him. But they did it anyway, and from Calais they issued a proclamation criticising Edward's government and demanding the removal of the Woodville family from power. Then they invaded. They landed in England with an army and began marching toward London. And here is where it gets complicated, because Warwick was still pretending this was not a rebellion against Edward. It was just a correction of bad advisors. They were doing this for Edward's own good, you see, helping him govern better. The fact that they were arriving with thousands of armed men was just a precaution. Edward, to his credit, saw through this immediately. He began raising his own army to confront Warwick and George. But before Edward could engage them in battle, something happened that changed everything. Warwick's supporters in the north rose up in rebellion and destroyed a Yorkist army at the Battle of Edgecote Moor. Suddenly Edward was isolated, outnumbered, and in serious danger. And then Warwick did something that proved he had completely lost perspective on reality. He captured King Edward IV, the man he had crowned, the man he had fought for at Towton, the man who by all rights should have been his greatest achievement. Warwick took him prisoner and held him in Middleham Castle like a common criminal. Think about the psychology of that decision. Warwick was so convinced of his own importance that he thought he could imprison a king, force him to comply with his demands, and everything would just go back to normal afterward. As if Edward would just forget about being kidnapped by his own subject. And for a few months, it almost worked. Warwick tried to govern in Edward's name, issuing orders and making decisions while keeping the king under lock and key. But the problem with imprisoning your king is that nobody takes your orders seriously if everyone knows you are holding the actual authority figure hostage. The government started falling apart. Regional conflicts erupted because there was no clear leadership, and Warwick realised he had created a disaster. So in December of 1469, Warwick did something that must have physically pained him. He let Edward go. He released the king, acted like the whole kidnapping thing had been a misunderstanding, and hoped that Edward would just move on and forgive him. Edward did not forgive him, but Edward was smart enough to pretend he did. He welcomed Warwick back to court, thanked him for his service, made all the right diplomatic noises, and then Edward quietly began planning revenge while simultaneously neutralising Warwick's power base. He promoted Woodville family members to key positions. He built alliances with nobles who hated Warwick. He systematically dismantled everything Warwick had built, all while smiling and acting like they were still friends. Warwick, realising what was happening, panicked, and in his panic, he made the most insane decision of his entire career. He decided to ally with Margaret of Anjou. Margaret of Anjou, the she-wolf of France. The woman who had killed Warwick's father at Wakefield. The woman whose army had been slaughtered by Warwick at Towton. The woman who represented everything Warwick had spent the last decade fighting against. Warwick decided to team up with her. How did this happen? How did the greatest Yorkist supporter end up working for the Lancastrians? The answer is pure wounded pride. Riet could not accept that Edward did not need him anymore. And if Edward was not going to be a grateful, obedient king, then Warwick would find a different king. Even if that king was the insane, incompetent Henry VI, even if that meant allying with his bitterest enemy. In 1470, Warwick fled to France. George went with him, because George was weak and easily led, and had tied his fate to Warwick's. And there, in the French court, Warwick negotiated an alliance with Margaret of Anjou that must have made both of them sick to their stomachs. The deal was this. Warwick would invade England with a Lancastrian army and restore Henry VI to the throne. In exchange, Warwick's younger daughter Anne would marry Margaret's son Edward of Lancaster, making Anne the future Queen of England when Edward succeeded his father. It was a brilliant political move that required everyone involved to swallow their pride and ignore the fact that they had spent years trying to kill each other. And here is the tragically romantic part of this story. Anne Neville was probably around 14 years old when she was married to Edward of Lancaster. She had grown up at Warwick's court, probably played with Edward's sisters when they were children, and now she was being married to a Lancastrian prince as a political bargaining chip. Did she have a choice? Of course not. Did she want to marry the son of the woman who'd killed her grandfather and displayed his head on a pike? Probably not. But medieval women did not get to choose their husbands based on personal feelings. The chronicles suggest that Margaret of Anjou insisted on a humiliating condition before the alliance could be finalised. Warwick had to publicly apologise for his role in the Yorkist victories. He had to admit that he had been wrong to support Edward. He had to essentially grovel, and Warwick did it, because at this point his pride was so wounded that even grovelling was preferable to admitting that Edward had outmanoeuvred him. In September of 1470, Warwick invaded England, and because Edward was distracted dealing with a rebellion in the north, likely stirred up by Warwick's agents, Warwick's forces met almost no resistance. They marched to London, freed Henry VI from the Tower of London, where he had been imprisoned for years, and restored him to the throne. Edward IV, King of England for 9 years, suddenly found himself a fugitive. He fled to the coast with his youngest brother Richard. Yes, the future Richard III, who unlike George had stayed loyal, and barely escaped to Flanders with his life. The chronicles describe Edward and Richard sailing away as Warwick's forces closed in, so desperate that they paid the ship's captain with the furs off their backs because they had no money. So for 6 months, from October 1470 to April 1471, Henry VI was king again. The redemption, historians call it. Warwick had done it. He had unmade one king and made another. The kingmaker had proven he really could control the throne. Except Henry was still completely insane. He still could not govern. And Warwick, having finally gotten what he thought he wanted, discovered that being in charge of an incapacitated king was even more exhausting than dealing with an uncooperative one. Henry would sit in council meetings and stare at the wall. He could not make decisions. He would sometimes forget he was king and ask when Edward was coming back. And meanwhile, Edward was not sitting quietly in exile. He was raising an army. He was calling in favours, and in March of 1471 he invaded. What happened next was a masterclass in military strategy and political manipulation. Edward landed in northern England with a small force. He claimed, and this is brilliant, that he was not there to reclaim the throne. He just wanted his dukedom of York back. Just his lands and titles, nothing more. This was a lie, obviously, but it gave wavering nobles an excuse to support him without immediately committing treason against Henry. As Edward marched south, his army grew. Towns opened their gates to him. Nobles who had been neutral suddenly remembered their loyalty to the Yorkist cause. And most importantly, George switched sides again. George, that weak-willed traitor, decided that maybe betraying Warwick was a better bet than betraying Edward. So he brought his troops over to Edward's side in the middle of the campaign. Can you imagine Warwick's face when he heard that George had defected back to Edward? The one ally Warwick thought he could count on, the brother he'd married his daughter to, had stabbed him in the back. Again. Because that's what George did. He betrayed everyone, constantly, whichever way the wind was blowing. Edward and Warwick's armies finally met at the Battle of Barnet on April 14th, 1471. It was fought in thick fog, so dense that soldiers could barely see 10 feet in front of them. In the chaos and confusion, Warwick's forces actually started fighting each other, mistaking allies for enemies. It was a disaster, and when the fog cleared, Warwick was dead. The kingmaker, the man who had crowned 2 kings and toppled 2 others, died on a battlefield trying to restore a king who did not even know what day it was. He was struck down trying to reach his horse to flee. Some chronicles say he died fighting, others say he was killed while running away. Either way, the most powerful nobleman in England died in the mud, and Edward made sure everyone knew it. He had Warwick's body displayed in London so people could see that the kingmaker was really truly dead. But Edward was not done. 3 weeks later, On May 4th, Edward fought another battle at Tewkesbury. This time his target was Margaret of Anjou and her son Edward of Lancaster. The battle was another Yorkist victory, and young Edward of Lancaster was killed, some say in battle. Others say he was executed after capture. Either way, Margaret's only son, the prince she had fought for all those years, was dead at 17. And poor Anne Neville. She was a widow at 15, her father dead, her husband dead, her entire family's power structure destroyed. What do you do when your father's ambition has cost you everything? But the final act of this bloody 3 years came on May the 21st, when Henry VI died in the Tower of London. The official story was that he died of melancholy upon hearing about his son's death. But nobody believed that then, and nobody believes it now. Henry was murdered, almost certainly on Edward's orders, because a deposed king who is still alive is a rallying point for rebellion. So in the space of 6 weeks, Edward had returned from exile, defeated Warwick, killed or captured every major Lancastrian leader, and secured his throne more thoroughly than ever before. The redemption was over. Henry was dead. Margaret was a prisoner. The Lancastrian cause was finished, but the cost of these victories was staggering. Brother had turned on brother. The greatest friendship of the age had ended in betrayal and death. And Edward had learned a terrible lesson. Trust no one. Not your advisors, not your allies. Not even your own blood. Because George was still alive, still ambitious, and still weak enough to make one more catastrophic decision that would end in the strangest execution in English history. If you could choose how you would die, what would you pick? A quick death in battle? Peacefully in your sleep? What about drowning in a barrel of wine? Because that is how George, Duke of Clarence, died in 1478. And it is either the strangest mercy killing in English history, or the most bizarre assassination ever recorded. Nobody knows for sure which one it was, but what we do know is that Edward IV ordered his own brother executed, and the method of execution was so unusual that people are still arguing about it 500 years later. This is the story of a man who could not stop betraying people even after they forgave him. A man so desperate to be important that he destroyed himself trying, and a family so fractured by ambition and suspicion that a king felt he had no choice but to kill his own blood. After the chaos of 1470 to 1471, after Warwick's rebellion and George's betrayal, you would think George would have learned his lesson. Edward had forgiven him, a remarkably generous act considering George had literally fought on the side of Edward's enemies. Edward welcomed him back to court, restored his titles and lands, and basically acted like the whole treason thing had been a youthful mistake. All George had to do was shut up, be grateful, and live out his life as a wealthy duke. George could not do it. He could not stop scheming. He could not stop resenting. He could not stop being George. The thing you need to understand about George is that he was trapped by his birth order. He was the middle son, and in medieval inheritance the middle son is in the worst possible position. The eldest son, Edward, gets the throne, the power, everything. The youngest son, Richard, gets to be the loyal supporter, the trusted lieutenant, with no expectation of more. But the middle son is close enough to power to taste it, but far enough away that he will never have it unless something terrible happens to everyone ahead of him. And George spent every day thinking about that. What if Edward died? What if Edward's children died? Then George would be king. The thought consumed him. It poisoned every interaction, every decision, every relationship. But let us back up and talk about what happened after Warwick died, because that is where George's final descent into paranoia began. When Warwick was killed at Barnet, he left behind 2 daughters, Isabel and Anne. Isabel was married to George. Remember, that was part of the whole rebellion plot. And Anne had been married to Edward of Lancaster, who was now also dead. These two young women were the sole heirs to the Warwick fortune, which was absolutely massive. Now here is where it gets complicated. George, as Isabel's husband, expected to control the entire Warwick inheritance. But Edward IV had other ideas. He wanted to split the inheritance between George and Richard. See, Richard had fallen in love with Anne Neville. Or maybe he just saw a chance to claim half of England's greatest fortune. Either way, Richard wanted to marry Anne, and Edward supported the match. George was furious. He did not want to share. So he did something incredibly petty and incredibly medieval. He tried to hide Anne. According to the chronicles, George dressed Anne as a kitchen maid and hid her in one of his London houses, hoping that if Richard could not find her, he could not marry her. Can you imagine? A duke, a brother of the king, playing hide-and-seek with his widowed sister-in-law so he can keep her inheritance for himself. Richard eventually found Anne. Some accounts say he discovered her actually working in the kitchens of a London townhouse, and the two were married in early 1472, but the damage was done. George and Richard, who'd been allies during the rebellion against Warwick, were now enemies over money, and Edward, sitting on the throne watching his brothers fight over an inheritance, must have been thinking, "This family is falling apart, and I am the only thing holding it together." The marriage to Isabel should have settled George down. She was wealthy, connected to the old Neville power structure, and by all accounts, they got along reasonably well. They had 4 children together, 2 sons and 2 daughters. For a few years, George seemed almost content. He had his wife, his children, his massive estates. He was one of the richest men in England. What more could he want? But then in December 1476, Isabel died. She was in her mid-20s, died shortly after giving birth to a son who also died. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous in medieval times, and Isabel's death was probably a straightforward medical tragedy. But George did not see it that way. George, whose mind was already warped by years of resentment and paranoia, decided that Isabel had been murdered. And specifically, he decided that she had been murdered by one of her servants, a woman named Anchoret Twinahoe, through witchcraft or poisoning. Now, was there any evidence for this? No, none whatsoever, but George was a powerful duke, and in 14th century England, if a duke accused you of murder, you were in serious trouble regardless of the evidence. George had Anchoret arrested, tried and executed within hours. He did not bother with a proper legal process. He just used his power to kill a woman who had probably done nothing wrong except be present when Isabel died. Edward was appalled. This was not justice. This was a rich man using his position to commit murder because he was angry and grieving. But Edward, still trying to keep the family together, did not punish George. He just warned him to stop making accusations and let the matter drop. George did not let it drop. Instead, he started making increasingly wild claims. He said that the Woodville family had poisoned Isabel. He said that Edward's marriage to Elizabeth was illegitimate because Edward had been betrothed to someone else first. He started spreading rumours that Edward himself was illegitimate, that their mother Cecily had had an affair, and Edward was not really their father's son. Do you see what George was doing? He was trying to delegitimize Edward's entire line. If Edward was illegitimate, then his children could not inherit. And who would be next in line? George, always George, positioning himself to be king. Edward tried one more time to manage George peacefully. In 1477, he suggested that George marry Mary of Burgundy, one of the wealthiest heiresses in Europe. It would have been a prestigious match that got George out of England and gave him something constructive to focus on. But George bungled the negotiations so badly, probably through a combination of arrogance and incompetence, that Mary ended up marrying someone else. And then George did something unforgivable. One of Edward's advisors, a man who had helped convict Anchoret Twinahoe in a proper retrial that cleared her name posthumously, was accused by George of plotting against him, and George, without consulting Edward, without any legal process, had this man arrested and executed. This was it. This was the moment Edward realised that George was not just annoying or incompetent, he was dangerous. Because George was now executing people on his own authority, acting like he was above the law, spreading treasonous rumours, and generally behaving like someone planning a rebellion. In June of 1477, Edward had George arrested and brought before Parliament on charges of treason. The charges were extensive, spreading false rumours about the king's legitimacy, executing people without authority, corresponding with enemies of the crown, and generally acting like he was preparing to challenge Edward's throne. George was given a trial. He defended himself. There was no defence lawyer in medieval trials. You had to speak for yourself. And by all accounts, George's defence was rambling, paranoid and unconvincing. He claimed there was a conspiracy against him. He said the Woodville family was trying to destroy him. He insisted he was loyal to Edward and that everything he had done was justified. The Parliament did not believe him. He was convicted of treason, and Edward, faced with the reality that his own brother was a traitor who had never stopped plotting, had to make an impossible decision. Here is where we need to pause and think about Edward's position. George was his brother. They had grown up together. They had fought in battles together. They had watched their father and youngest brother die at Wakefield. Family meant everything in medieval culture. You were supposed to protect your kin, support them, forgive them their flaws, but George had betrayed Edward multiple times. He had fought on Warwick's side against Edward. He had spread treasonous rumours. He had executed people without authority. He was actively working to delegitimize Edward's children. And most importantly, as long as George was alive, he was a rallying point for anyone who wanted to challenge Edward's rule. What would you do? Would you forgive your brother one more time knowing he would probably betray you again? Would you imprison him for life, keeping him locked away like a dangerous animal? Or would you do what medieval logic demanded and eliminate the threat permanently? Edward chose execution. And here is where the story gets strange. George was sentenced to death in February of 1478, but the execution did not happen immediately. Edward kept delaying it. Days passed, then weeks. Parliament had to actually petition Edward to carry out the sentence, because it was clear Edward was struggling with the decision. Finally, on February 18th, 1478, George was executed privately in the Tower of London. The official records are frustratingly vague about the method. They just say he was put to death. But later chronicles, written decades after the fact, include a detail that has fascinated people for centuries. George was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. A butt is a large barrel, about 108 gallons. Malmsey is a sweet Portuguese wine that George apparently loved, and the story says that George was either drowned in a barrel of it or, in some versions, allowed to choose his method of execution and pick this one. Is it true? We have no idea. The contemporary records do not mention wine at all. The story might have been invented later as dark humour. George loved wine so much he died in it, get it? Or it might have been a deliberate choice, a way for Edward to give his brother a death that was not as brutal as beheading or hanging. Drowning in wine is still drowning, still terrible, but maybe it seemed more merciful than the alternatives. Some historians think George requested this method as a final act of dark comedy, one last way to thumb his nose at Edward, even in death. Others think Edward specifically chose it as a way to make the execution less horrific for the family to think about. Your brother did not get beheaded like a common traitor. He drowned in expensive wine like the dramatic fool he always was. We will never know the truth. But what we do know is that Edward was devastated by George's death. Multiple chronicles mention that Edward seemed haunted by the execution, that he became more paranoid and suspicious afterward, that he deeply regretted having to kill his own brother even though George had given him no choice. And Richard, the youngest brother, the loyal one, watched all of this happen. Richard watched George betray Edward multiple times. He watched Edward forgive George multiple times. He watched George spiral into paranoia and treason. And then he watched Edward order George's execution and struggle with the guilt of it. What do you think that did to Richard? What do you think it taught him about family, about loyalty, about the price of ambition? Because in just 5 years, Richard would be making his own impossible decisions about family and power, and the lessons he learned from George's death would shape those decisions in ways that would haunt England for centuries. But before we get to Richard's story, before we talk about what happened when Edward died and left the kingdom to a 12-year-old boy, we need to understand what George's death meant for the York family. It meant that trust was broken forever. It meant that Edward could never again assume family loyalty. It meant that the White Rose, which had survived so many external enemies, was being poisoned from within by ambition and paranoia. The York brothers, Edward, George and Richard, had started as allies, fighting together to avenge their father and claim the throne. Now one was dead by the other's order. One was king but haunted by guilt. And one was watching and learning and preparing for the moment when he would have to make his own terrible choices about family and power. That moment was coming. Edward IV had about 5 years left to live. And when he died, the questions that haunted him, can you trust your own family? How far will people go for power? What do you do when the person threatening your throne is your own blood? Those questions would fall to Richard, and Richard's answers would create the greatest mystery in English history and end the House of York forever. Death comes for everyone eventually, but when death comes for a king, especially a king who is not properly prepared for what happens next, it does not just take one life, it destroys an entire kingdom. April 9th, 1483. Edward IV wakes up feeling ill after a fishing trip. Within a week, he is dead at age 40, and in that 1 week, everything he built, the peace, the stability, the carefully balanced power structure, begins to crumble. Because Edward made one fatal mistake, he assumed he had more time, and now his 12-year-old son is king, his queen is terrified, his youngest brother is suddenly the most powerful man in England, and a group of children are about to become pawns in a game that will end with one of history's greatest mysteries and the extinction of the York dynasty. This is where the tragedy shifts from political intrigue to something more intimate and heartbreaking. Because up until now, the Wars of the Roses have been about adults making terrible decisions. But what comes next involves children. Innocent children who never asked to be born royal, who never wanted to be caught in this web of ambition and violence, who just wanted to grow up and live their lives, and they never got that chance. Let us talk about Edward IV in his final years, because you need to understand what kind of kingdom he was leaving behind. After the chaos of 1469 to 1471, after defeating Warwick and executing George, Edward finally got what he wanted: peace. From 1471 to 1483, England experienced the longest period of internal stability it had seen in decades. Edward used those years wisely. He rebuilt the economy, promoted trade, patronized the arts. He was not a great intellectual. He did not found universities or write poetry, but he understood money and knew how to make England prosperous. The royal treasury, which had been bankrupt when he took the throne, was actually running a surplus by the 1480s. That is almost unheard of for a medieval monarchy, and he was beloved by the common people. Contemporary chronicles describe him as accessible, friendly, someone who would walk through London markets and actually talk to merchants and craftsmen. One account describes Edward stopping to chat with the wife of a London tradesman for so long that his courtiers got impatient. He was charismatic in a way that made people forget he had ordered the deaths of tens of thousands at Towton. But there were cracks in this peaceful facade. Edward was aging, and not gracefully. Contemporary accounts suggest he had gained a lot of weight in his later years. All those feasts and that legendary appetite had caught up with him. One Italian visitor described Edward as somewhat fat in the late 1470s. By 1483 he was probably significantly overweight, which would have put strain on his health, and there was tension at court. The Woodville family, Elizabeth's relatives, had consolidated power over the last decade. They controlled key positions in government and had influence over Edward's children. Meanwhile, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward's youngest brother, had spent most of those years in the north, governing the border regions with Scotland. Richard was loyal, competent, and had been rewarded with significant power in northern England. But he was not part of the inner circle at court. This geographic and political division would become crucial when Edward died. The Woodvilles were in London, close to power. Richard was hundreds of miles away in Yorkshire, and that distance would determine how the succession crisis played out. In early April of 1483, Edward went on a fishing trip. Yes, a fishing trip. The King of England, the great warrior who had won the bloodiest battle in British history, went fishing with some friends. It was apparently a favourite pastime of his, getting away from court, spending time on the river, just relaxing. But the weather was terrible. Cold, rainy, typical English spring weather that makes you wonder why anyone thought fishing was a good idea. Edward got soaked, and sometime during or shortly after this fishing expedition, he caught what the chronicles describe as a chill or cold. Modern historians think it was probably pneumonia or possibly typhoid fever, both diseases that could kill you in medieval times even if you were the king. Within days, Edward was seriously ill. Within a week, he knew he was dying. And this is where things get interesting, because Edward, lying on his deathbed, suddenly realised he had not adequately prepared for his son to take over. Edward V. Yes, there was an Edward V, though he never actually got crowned, was 12 years old at the time of his father's death. He was living in Ludlow Castle in Wales, being raised and educated by his maternal uncle Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers. The boy had been groomed for kingship, but nobody expected him to have to take the throne so soon. Everyone assumed Edward IV had at least another decade or two to live, but here is Edward on his deathbed, and he needs to make some quick decisions. Who is going to govern England while his son is underage? The obvious answer would be the boy's mother, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, but that creates problems. The Woodville family is already unpopular with many nobles who resent their rapid rise to power. Making Elizabeth the regent would essentially give the Woodvilles total control of the government. The alternative is Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward's brother, experienced in government, loyal, respected in the north. And as the king's uncle, he has a reasonable claim to be Lord Protector of the realm until young Edward comes of age. But Richard has been distant from court for years. Does Edward still trust him after what happened with George? According to the chronicles, Edward made a deathbed decision that he hoped would satisfy everyone. He appointed Richard as Lord Protector, but made the council, which included several Woodville family members, responsible for key decisions. He was trying to balance power between Richard and the Woodvilles, hoping they would cooperate for the sake of the young king. It was a terrible plan, because what Edward created was not a balanced power structure. It was a competition for control of a child king, and whoever controlled the young Edward would effectively rule England. Edward IV died on April 9th, 1483. He was 40 years old. Contemporary accounts describe his death as surprisingly quick. He went from healthy and active to dead in less than 2 weeks. His body was buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, in the same chapel where he had married Elizabeth Woodville 19 years earlier. There should have been grand state funeral processions, weeks of mourning, elaborate ceremonies, but there was no time for any of that. Because the moment Edward died, everyone started moving. Fast. Elizabeth Woodville, in London, immediately called a council meeting. She wanted to crown her son as quickly as possible, get him to London, have the coronation, make him officially king before anyone could object. Once Edward V was crowned and anointed, he would be untouchable. That was the plan. Her brother Anthony was in Ludlow with the young king. They started making preparations to bring Edward to London with an armed escort. Not a huge army, but enough soldiers to make it clear that the Woodvilles were in charge, and anyone who objected would be dealing with military force. And Richard? Richard was in Yorkshire when he heard about his brother's death, and according to the reports, he wept. He had loved Edward, had been loyal to him through everything, had watched Edward execute their brother George, and had stood by that decision because George was a traitor. Richard had spent his adult life being the good brother, the loyal one, the one who did not betray or scheme or cause problems. And now Edward was dead, and Richard was suddenly responsible for protecting Edward's son and governing the kingdom. The problem was that Richard did not trust the Woodvilles. He had watched them accumulate power for 2 decades. He had seen how they operated, and he probably suspected correctly that if he did not act fast, the Woodvilles would sideline him completely and rule through the boy king. So Richard did something that would be analysed and argued about for the next 500 years. He rode south with his own armed force and intercepted young Edward's party before they reached London. The meeting happened at Stony Stratford on April 29th. Richard was accompanied by the Duke of Buckingham, a powerful nobleman who had his own grievances against the Woodville family. They met Anthony Woodville, who was escorting the young king, and Richard did something that changed everything. He arrested Anthony Woodville and several other Woodville supporters. He accused them of plotting against him and planning to exclude him from his rightful role as Lord Protector. And then Richard took custody of young Edward, claiming he was protecting his nephew from bad advisors. Was this a rescue or a kidnapping? It depends on who you ask. From Richard's perspective, he was doing exactly what his brother had asked, taking up his role as Lord Protector and protecting the young king from a family that was trying to monopolise power. From Elizabeth's perspective, Richard had just arrested her brother and taken her son prisoner. When news reached London, Elizabeth panicked. She knew what happened to people who lost power struggles in this family. She had watched Edward execute his own brother. She had seen what happened at Towton, at Tewkesbury, at every battle where the losing side was hunted down and killed. So Elizabeth did the only thing she could think of: she ran. With her remaining children, 5 daughters and 1 son, Richard, Duke of York, Elizabeth fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. Westminster Abbey had chartered sanctuary, meaning it was legally protected space where even the king's men could not arrest you. Elizabeth had used this sanctuary before, back in 1470 when Warwick had briefly restored Henry VI, so she knew the routine. She gathered her children, grabbed what valuables she could carry, and barricaded herself in the abbey. Can you imagine the fear she must have felt? Her husband is dead, her brother is arrested, her eldest son is in the custody of a man she does not trust, and she is hiding in a church with her other children, not knowing if they are about to be killed or if this is just a political manoeuvre that will blow over. Meanwhile, Richard arrived in London with young Edward, and on the surface everything seemed fine. Richard publicly swore loyalty to his nephew. He arranged for Edward to be housed in the Tower of London, which was a royal residence, not just a prison at this time, to await his coronation, which was scheduled for June 22nd. Richard was acting like a proper Lord Protector, making decisions for the good of the realm, preparing for his nephew's coronation. But there were signs that something was wrong. Richard was arresting people. Woodville supporters were being removed from positions of power, and most ominously, Richard was making arguments about why young Edward might not be the legitimate king. See, there was a legal issue that nobody had really thought about before. Remember how Edward IV had married Elizabeth Woodville in secret? Well, there were rumours, and they were just rumours at the time, that Edward had been previously engaged to another woman, Eleanor Butler, before he married Elizabeth. If that was true, if Edward had been legally contracted to Eleanor Butler, then his marriage to Elizabeth was bigamous and invalid, which would make all of their children illegitimate, which would mean Edward V could not legally be king. Was this true? We have no idea. Eleanor Butler had died years earlier, and there was no way to verify the claim. But the timing is suspicious. This rumour suddenly became important right when Richard needed a reason to question Edward V's right to the throne. And here is where we reach the moment that defines everything that comes after. On June 16th, 1483, Richard convinced Elizabeth Woodville to release her younger son, Richard, Duke of York, from sanctuary. The official reason was that young Edward was lonely in the Tower and wanted his brother for company. Elizabeth, probably under pressure and possibly under threat, agreed. She let 9-year-old Richard go to join his 12-year-old brother in the Tower, and she never saw him again. She never saw either of them again. Because what happened next is one of the greatest mysteries in English history, a tragedy that haunts Westminster Abbey and the Tower of London to this day, a crime so terrible that people still argue about who was responsible 5 centuries later. 2 princes, a tower, and a summer that would end with the White Rose drowning in the blood of children. What is the worst crime you can imagine? Murder is terrible, betrayal is heartbreaking, but murdering children who never had a chance to grow up, who never did anything wrong except be born into the wrong family at the wrong time, that crosses into territory that makes your soul hurt just thinking about it. And that is exactly what we are about to discuss, the most haunting unsolved mystery in English history. 2 young boys locked in a tower in the summer of 1483 who were seen playing and shooting arrows one day and then simply vanished. No bodies, no confession, no closure, just silence that has echoed for over 500 years. Were they murdered? Almost certainly. By whom? That is where the arguments begin. Richard III. The obvious suspect, except the evidence is not as clear as you might think. Henry VII. He had just as much to gain from their deaths. Someone else entirely, maybe. The only thing we know for certain is that 2 innocent children disappeared, and the person responsible got away with it. Let me introduce you to these boys properly, because they were not just the princes in the Tower. They were real children with personalities and dreams, and a future that was stolen from them. Edward V, born November 2nd, 1470, which made him 12 years old in the summer of 1483. He was the eldest son of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, raised from birth to be king. Contemporary accounts describe him as intelligent, well-educated, and mature for his age. He'd been living in Ludlow Castle in Wales, learning how to govern, studying Latin and French, preparing for the responsibility of ruling England. Think about what his life must have been like. Everyone around him treating him with reverence because he was the prince, the heir, the future king. He probably had tutors and servants and guards. He probably never had a day of his life where he was just a normal kid playing with friends. Everything was about duty, preparation, destiny, and then his father died, and suddenly that future everyone had been preparing him for was within reach. He was King Edward V. At 12 years old, he had achieved what his grandfather and great-grandfather had fought and died for. The York family had won. The White Rose would bloom for another generation. Except it did not work out that way. Richard, Duke of York, Edward's younger brother, was born August 17th, 1473. He was 9 years old in 1483, named after the grandfather he never met, the Richard whose head had been stuck on a pike at Wakefield. Young Richard had been created Duke of York when he was just an infant, continuing the tradition of the monarch's second son holding that title. By all accounts, he was a cheerful, energetic boy, less serious than his older brother, probably because he did not have the weight of future kingship on his shoulders. Richard had been married at age 4 to Anne Mowbray, a 5-year-old heiress in one of those strategic marriages that medieval nobility arranged. Anne died when she was only 8, making young Richard a widower before he was 10. So this boy had already experienced loss and political manoeuvring in his short life. These were the two boys who ended up in the Tower of London in the summer of 1483, and we need to be very clear about what the Tower was at this time. Yes, it was a prison, but it was also a royal palace. It was traditional for monarchs to stay in the Tower before their coronation. It was where you lived while preparing for that grand ceremony. So when Edward V was taken to the Tower on May the 19th, it was not necessarily sinister. It was protocol. The boys were initially housed in the royal apartments. Multiple witnesses reported seeing them in the gardens of the Tower, playing, shooting arrows, seeming perfectly fine. An Italian visitor named Dominic Mancini, who was in London during this time, later wrote that he saw the boys at the windows of their apartments, and that people could see them from outside the Tower walls. But then, as summer progressed, the sightings became less frequent. The boys were moved to inner chambers, away from windows. Fewer people were allowed to see them, and by late July or early August nobody was seeing them at all. So what happened? Let us walk through the timeline carefully, because the truth is buried in the details. June 22nd was supposed to be Edward V's coronation day. That was the date Parliament had set for the ceremony. But on June 25th, 3 days after the coronation should have happened, Parliament passed an act called Titulus Regius. This act declared that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid because Edward had been previously contracted to Lady Eleanor Butler. Therefore, all of Edward and Elizabeth's children were illegitimate, bastards who could not inherit the throne. This is convenient, is it not? Right when Richard needs a legal justification to take the throne from his nephew, suddenly there is documentary evidence that his nephew is illegitimate. The timing is so perfect that it strains credibility. But nobody could disprove it. Eleanor Butler was dead, Edward IV was dead, and the only people who would have known the truth were not talking. On June 26th, Richard was offered the crown by Parliament. He accepted. On July 6th, he was crowned King Richard III. The princes, now officially bastards with no claim to the throne, remained in the Tower. Now here is what makes this situation so sinister. If Richard genuinely believed the boys were illegitimate, if he genuinely thought he was the rightful king and they were just his nephews with no political importance, then why keep them locked up? Why not let them go? Why not send them away to live quietly in the countryside where they could not cause trouble? The answer, and this is crucial, is that it did not matter what Richard believed. What mattered was what other people believed. And there were plenty of people in England who did not accept Titulus Regius, who thought it was a convenient fiction, who believed that Edward V was the rightful king and Richard was a usurper. As long as those boys were alive, they were a rallying point for rebellion. As long as people could point to them and say there is the real king, Richard's throne was insecure. So Richard had a problem. He could not let the boys go free because they would become figureheads for his enemies. But keeping them locked up indefinitely just postponed the problem. Eventually, someone would try to rescue them or use them as justification for rebellion. The only way to permanently solve the problem was to make sure the boys could never be used against him. Do you see where this is going? Because there are only two logical outcomes here. Either Richard killed the princes to secure his throne, or he kept them alive and dealt with constant threats of rebellion. And the historical record suggests that at some point in late summer of 1483, those boys disappeared. The most detailed account we have comes from Thomas More, writing about 30 years after the events. More says that Richard ordered Sir James Tyrrell to organise the murder. Tyrrell and two accomplices, John Dighton and Miles Forrest, entered the prince's chamber at night while the boys were sleeping. They smothered the children with pillows pressed hard over their faces until they stopped breathing. Then they buried the bodies at the foot of a staircase in the tower. This account is incredibly detailed and specific. More names, describes the method, explains the logistics. But here is the problem. More was writing decades later, during the Tudor period, when there was every political reason to paint Richard as a monster. More was also only about 5 years old when the princes disappeared, so he was not a witness. He got his information from people who claimed to have known what happened, but we have no way to verify if those people were telling the truth or just repeating propaganda. And there is another problem with the official story. Tyrrell. According to More, Tyrrell confessed to the murders in 1502, 19 years after the fact, when he was being executed for a completely different crime, treason against Henry VII. But we do not have the actual text of this confession. We only have More's second-hand account of what Tyrrell supposedly said. Was there really a confession? Did Tyrrell actually say what More claims he said? Or was this confession invented to give closure to a crime that had haunted England for 2 decades? Here is what we know for certain from contemporary sources. An Italian diplomat wrote in July 1483 that there were rumours the princes were dead. A French official, Guillaume de Rochefort, stated in January 1484 that Richard had killed his nephews. These are not proofs, they are rumours and accusations, but they show that people at the time suspected the boys were dead and blamed Richard. But suspicion is not proof, and this is where the mystery deepens, because there are alternative theories that are just as plausible as Richard being the murderer. Theory 1. The boys actually died of natural causes. Medieval childhood was dangerous. Disease, poor medical care, accidents. Children died all the time, even royal children. Edward V was described by a doctor as being in poor health during his time in the Tower. Is it possible he got sick and died, and then Richard panicked and also killed the younger brother to prevent him from becoming a rallying point? Or maybe both boys caught some illness and died naturally, and Richard covered it up because he knew everyone would assume he had killed them. Theory 2. Henry VII had them killed. This sounds crazy because Henry did not take the throne until 1485, 2 years after the boys disappeared. But what if the boys were still alive in 1485? What if Richard had kept them hidden but alive, and then Henry found them after winning the crown and quietly had them murdered because they were inconvenient to his own claim? Henry had just as much reason to want those boys dead as Richard did. Maybe more, because Henry's claim to the throne was shakier than Richard's. Theory 3. The Duke of Buckingham did it without Richard's knowledge. Buckingham was Richard's close ally in the coup that put Richard on the throne. But Buckingham rebelled against Richard in October 1483, just a few months later. What if Buckingham killed the princes on his own initiative, thinking he was doing Richard a favour, and that is what caused the break between them? Maybe Richard found out what Buckingham had done and was horrified, and that is why Buckingham ended up executed for treason. We will never know which theory is correct. Unless someone invents a time machine, this mystery will remain unsolved. But I want to focus on something that often gets lost in all the speculation about who done it. The human tragedy of what happened. 2 boys, 12 and 9 years old, locked in a room in a stone tower during what should have been the summer of their lives. Did they understand what was happening to them? Did they know they were in danger? Or did they think their uncle was just keeping them safe until things settled down? Imagine being Edward, the eldest. You were supposed to be king. You were preparing for your coronation. Everyone told you that you were special, chosen by God, destined for greatness. And then suddenly, you are a prisoner. Your title is stripped away. People are calling you a bastard, and you are locked in a tower with only your little brother for company. And imagine being Richard, the younger boy. You do not really understand politics. You just know that your father died, then your mother was scared and took you to a church, then you were sent to be with your brother in this cold stone building, and now nobody will tell you when you can go home. Did they ask their guards when they could leave? Did they write letters to their mother that were never delivered? Did they cry themselves to sleep? Did they comfort each other, the older brother, promising the younger one that everything would be okay even though he did not believe it himself? And on the night they died, whether it was murder or illness or something else, were they scared? Did they suffer? Did they have time to pray or call for their mother? Or did death come quickly in their sleep before they even knew it was happening? These questions haunt me, and they should haunt you too, because this is not just a historical mystery, it is a reminder of what happens when adults let their ambition and fear turn the children into casualties. In 1674, nearly 200 years after the princes disappeared, workers renovating the Tower of London found a wooden box buried under a staircase. Inside were the skeletons of 2 children. The location matched Thomas More's account of where the bodies were buried. The bones were examined and declared to be consistent with boys aged around 10 and 13, roughly the ages of the princes when they disappeared. King Charles II ordered the bones reburied in Westminster Abbey in an elaborate ceremony. They are there today, in an urn designed by Christopher Wren, with an inscription calling them the murdered princes. For nearly 350 years, those bones have been treated as the remains of Edward and Richard. But are they? In 1933, the bones were briefly examined by the medical experts who concluded they were probably the princes. But the examination was limited and not very scientific by modern standards. DNA testing could definitively prove whether those bones belonged to the York family. But the royal family has refused to allow DNA testing. Why? What are they predicted? Or are they simply respecting the dead and refusing to turn a sacred burial site into a crime scene investigation? So the mystery continues. 2 boys, a tower, a summer when childhood ended forever, and a question that echoes through 5 centuries. Who killed the princes, and why won't anyone admit it? But one thing is certain, their disappearance doomed Richard III, because even if Richard did not kill them, everyone thought he did, and that made him the most hated king in English history, and that hatred would cost him everything. When everything you ever fought for comes down to one afternoon in a muddy field, how do you want to face it? Do you run? Do you negotiate? Or do you charge straight at your enemy, crown on your head, sword in your hand, knowing you will probably die, but refusing to go down as a coward? Richard III chose the charge, and that choice, that moment of reckless, desperate, almost suicidal bravery, defines him more than anything else he ever did. On August 22nd, 1485, the last Plantagenet King of England died fighting in the mud of Bosworth Field. His crown rolled into a bush, his body was stripped naked, abused, and thrown over a horse like a piece of meat. And the dynasty that had ruled England for 331 years ended with a 32-year-old man bleeding out in a ditch, still clutching his sword. But here is what nobody tells you about Richard III. His reign was doomed from the moment he took the throne. Not because he was evil or incompetent, but because too many people believed he had murdered his nephews. And once that belief took hold, nothing Richard did, no law he passed, no reform he attempted, No kindness he showed could erase the image of a child killer sitting on a throne stained with innocent blood. So let us talk about Richard's 2-year reign, because it is one of the most tragic and misunderstood periods in English history. And let us talk about how a man who was probably trying to do the right thing ended up becoming the villain in one of Shakespeare's greatest plays and the face of pure evil for centuries. Richard was born on October 2nd, 1452, at Fotheringhay Castle. He was the youngest of the 4 York brothers who survived to adulthood, after Edward, Edmund, who died at Wakefield, and George. Richard grew up during the Wars of the Roses, which means his childhood was defined by violence and uncertainty. He was only 7 years old when his father's head was stuck on a pike at Wakefield. He was 8 when he watched his brother Edward win the crown at Towton. And unlike George, who grew up resentful and treacherous, Richard became fiercely loyal. He supported Edward through everything, the battles, the political crises, even the painful decision to execute George. Contemporary accounts describe Richard as serious, competent, and deeply committed to Edward's cause. He governed the north of England with efficiency and apparent fairness. People in Yorkshire liked him. He was not charismatic like Edward, but he was reliable. Physical descriptions of Richard are complicated by centuries of propaganda. Shakespeare famously portrayed him as a hunchbacked monster, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time. But that is Tudor propaganda designed to make Richard look like an outward manifestation of inner evil. The real Richard did have scoliosis, a curved spine, which we know because his skeleton was found in 2012 under a parking lot in Leicester and examined by scientists. The curvature was significant but not as extreme as Shakespeare suggests. Richard probably had one shoulder higher than the other and might have walked with a slight limp, but he was not the twisted monster of legend. In fact, Richard was an accomplished horseman and skilled fighter, which would have been difficult if he were as physically deformed as the plays suggest. But the scoliosis is important because it might have contributed to his reputation. Medieval people often saw physical disability as a sign of the moral failing or divine punishment. So Richard's curved spine became evidence in people's minds that he was fundamentally wrong. When Richard took the throne in July 1483, he genuinely believed, or at least publicly claimed to believe, that he was saving England from chaos. The Woodville family was grasping for power. The young king was illegitimate. Richard, as the last surviving legitimate son of Richard, Duke of York, was the rightful heir. He was not a usurper. He was a loyal brother doing his duty. And you know what? For the first few months, Richard seemed to be a decent king. He went on a royal progress through the Midlands and in the north, showing himself to his subjects, hearing legal cases, addressing grievances. He passed laws reforming the bail system and making legal proceedings more accessible to common people. He promoted trade and commercial development. By all accounts, Richard was trying to be the kind of just, accessible king that people respected. But none of that mattered, because everyone was whispering about the princes. Where were they? Why had nobody seen them since summer? Richard never directly addressed the rumours. He never explained what happened to his nephews, and that silence was damning. If the boys were alive, why not show them? If they were dead of natural causes, why not announce it? The only explanation that made sense to most people was the worst one. Richard had killed them and was trying to cover it up. In October 1483, barely 3 months into Richard's reign, a major rebellion broke out. And the leader was someone Richard should have been able to trust. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham. This is the same Buckingham who had helped Richard seize power, who had supported Richard's claim to the throne, who had been richly rewarded with lands and titles. Why did Buckingham rebel? Historians still debate this. Some think Buckingham was genuinely horrified when he realised Richard had killed the princes. Maybe Buckingham thought Richard would just keep them imprisoned, and when he found out about the murders, his conscience rebelled. Others think Buckingham had his own ambitions and saw an opportunity to seize power while Richard's position was weak. And some think Buckingham was recruited by Margaret Beaufort, the mother of a young man named Henry Tudor, who had his own claim to the throne. The rebellion failed. Buckingham was captured and executed in November 1483. But the damage was done. Richard now knew that his own allies were willing to betray him, that his throne was fundamentally unstable, that people were actively plotting to replace him. And then Richard's personal life fell apart in the most heartbreaking way. In April 1484, Richard's only legitimate son, Edward of Middleham, died. He was about 10 years old. The cause of death is unknown. Probably some illness, maybe tuberculosis or dysentery. Medieval medicine could not save him. Richard and his wife Anne were devastated. Anne never really recovered from the grief. She became ill, probably tuberculosis as well, and died in March 1485, just shy of her 29th birthday, so Richard lost his son and his wife within a year. He was left with no direct heirs, no family to speak of except some distant relatives and illegitimate children. And the rumours about the princes were getting louder. People were saying that Richard's losses were divine punishment for murdering his nephews. God was taking away Richard's children because Richard had killed his brother's children. Whether you believe in divine justice or not, you have to admit the optics were terrible. Meanwhile, in France, Henry Tudor was gathering an army. Henry Tudor, later Henry VII, had the weakest claim to the English throne of anyone we have discussed. His claim came through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, who was descended from John of Gaunt through an illegitimate line that had been explicitly barred from the succession. Legally, Henry had almost no right to the throne, but law does not matter when you have an army and the current king is so unpopular that half the nobility is willing to betray him. Henry invaded England in August 1485. He landed in Wales and began marching east toward Richard's position. And Richard, despite being advised to wait and gather more forces, decided to engage Henry immediately. Maybe he was confident of victory. Maybe he was tired of running and hiding and defending his throne from constant threats. Or maybe he just wanted it to be over. The two armies met near Market Bosworth in Leicestershire on August 22, 1485. Richard had more soldiers, probably around 10,000 to 15,000 compared to Henry's 5,000. On paper, Richard should have won easily, but medieval battles were not just about numbers, they were about loyalty, and Richard was about to discover that some of his most powerful supporters were not loyal at all. The key players were the Stanley family, Lord Stanley and his brother Sir William Stanley. They had brought thousands of troops to the battlefield, but they had not committed to either side. They were literally watching from the sidelines, waiting to see which way the battle would go before deciding who to support. This was smart politics, but terrible for Richard, who had counted on their support. The battle began in the morning. Richard's forces were positioned on Ambion Hill, giving them the high ground. Henry's forces advanced. The initial clashes seemed to favour Richard. His experienced soldiers were pushing Henry's forces back, but Richard could see the Stanleys watching from the side, refusing to commit. And Richard made a decision that was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, depending on your perspective. Richard saw Henry Tudor himself on the battlefield, surrounded by a relatively small bodyguard. Richard was an experienced warrior. He knew how medieval battles worked. If you killed the enemy commander, the battle was over. The enemy forces would scatter or surrender. So Richard did something almost no medieval king would do. He personally led a cavalry charge directly at Henry Tudor. Can you imagine what this must have looked like? The King of England, wearing his crown over his helmet, charging across the battlefield with his knights, aiming straight for the pretender who was trying to steal his throne. It was glorious and insane and desperate all at once. Richard actually got close enough to kill Henry's standard-bearer and several of Henry's bodyguards. For a moment, it seemed like Richard might actually pull it off, but then Sir William Stanley made his decision. He ordered his troops to attack Richard's forces, and suddenly Richard's brave charge turned into a trap. He was surrounded by enemies, cut off from his own army, outnumbered and fighting for his life. The chronicles describe Richard's final moments in terms that are almost admiring. He fought like a demon. He refused to flee even when it was clear he was going to die. Someone offered to bring him a horse so he could escape, and Richard supposedly shouted, "I will not budge a foot, I will die King of England." Whether he actually said those exact words or not, the sentiment was clear. Richard was not going to run, he was going to die fighting. And he did. Richard was struck down in the chaos of battle, probably by a blow to the head that pierced his helmet. The exact details of his death are unclear. Multiple people probably claim to have killed the king afterward, but we know he died in that muddy field still wearing his crown. Then the abuse began. Richard's body was stripped naked. It was thrown over a horse and paraded through the streets of Leicester, so everyone could see that the king was really dead. At some point, the corpse was stabbed or mutilated. There is evidence of wounds inflicted after death, probably by soldiers wanting to desecrate the body of the man they saw as a child murderer and usurper. Richard was buried hastily and without ceremony in Greyfriars Church in Leicester. No royal funeral, no elaborate tomb, just a simple grave for the last Plantagenet king. And there Richard's body lay for 527 years, until August 25, 2012, when archaeologists found his skeleton under a parking lot in Leicester. The discovery was one of the most extraordinary archaeological finds of the 21st century. DNA testing confirmed it was really Richard. They matched his DNA to living descendants through the female line. The skeleton showed the scoliosis, the battle wounds, everything the chronicles had described. When Richard's remains were finally given a proper burial in Leicester Cathedral in March 2015, thousands of people attended. There was a ceremony, speeches, a specially designed coffin with a white rose engraved on it. 530 years late, Richard finally got the royal funeral he never had. But the question remains, was Richard III a villain or a victim? Did he murder his nephews, or was he framed by Tudor propaganda? Was he a usurper, or the rightful king trying to save England from chaos? We will never know for certain. What we do know is that Richard's 2-year reign was marked by constant crisis, personal tragedy, and an inability to escape the shadow of those 2 missing princes. Whether he killed them or not, their disappearance destroyed him. It made his throne unstable, his allies untrustworthy, his legacy forever stained. And when he died at Bosworth, the White Rose died with him. The last King of York, the last of the Plantagenets, the end of a dynasty that had ruled England for over 3 centuries, and the beginning of something new, a Tudor dynasty that would rewrite history to make themselves look like heroes and Richard look like a monster. But there is one final chapter to this story, because the White Rose did not actually die at Bosworth. It merged with the Red Rose of Lancaster to create something new, and that merger, that attempt to heal England's wounds by uniting the 2 warring houses, is where our tragic tale finally finds something resembling hope. Richard III died in the mud at Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485. His crown rolled into a thorn bush. Lord Stanley picked it up and placed it on Henry Tudor's head right there on the battlefield, still covered in blood and dirt. And just like that, the Wars of the Roses should have been over. The White Rose of York was defeated. The Red Rose of Lancaster had won. England could finally have peace. Except it wasn't that simple, because wars like this don't end with a single battle. The wounds cut too deep. The hatred ran too strong, and even when you think you've won, the ghosts of the past keep coming back to haunt you. Henry Tudor, now Henry VII, knew he had a problem. Yes, he had won the battle. Yes, he had the crown. But his claim to the throne was weaker than almost anyone else in England. Remember, his claim came through his mother Margaret Beaufort, who was descended from an illegitimate line that had been explicitly barred from succession. By blood alone, Henry had no right to sit on England's throne. He was a usurper, plain and simple. But Henry was smart. He understood something that the Yorkists had never fully grasped. Sometimes the best way to end a war is not to crush your enemy completely, but to absorb them, to make them part of your story instead of destroying them. So Henry did something brilliant. In January 1486, just 5 months after Bosworth, he married Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, the beautiful, gentle princess who had lost her father, her brothers, her uncle's protection, everything. And now she was marrying the man who had killed her uncle and taken the throne. Think about what this marriage meant. Elizabeth of York had the strongest claim to the throne of anyone alive. She was Edward IV's legitimate daughter. If England had allowed queens to rule in their own right, like they later would with Elizabeth I and Queen Victoria, Elizabeth of York would have been Queen of England, not Henry. But this was 1486. Women didn't rule, they married rulers, so Elizabeth married Henry. And with that marriage, Henry Tudor gained legitimacy he could never have won on a battlefield. Their union combined the red rose of Lancaster with the white rose of York, and Henry created a new symbol, the Tudor rose, a red rose with a white rose in the centre. Red and white, Lancaster and York, enemies united at last. It's a beautiful symbol. It appears everywhere in Tudor architecture. You can still see it carved into the ceilings of Hampton Court Palace and Westminster Abbey. Red and white petals intertwined, promising that the bloodshed was over, that England was healed, that the two warring houses had become one. But symbols are easier than reality, because the thing about merging two dynasties is that you don't actually erase the past, you just complicate it. Henry and Elizabeth's marriage was, by all accounts, a genuine love match. This is surprising given that it was purely political, but contemporary sources suggest they actually cared for each other. Elizabeth gave Henry 7 children, including Arthur, named after the legendary King Arthur, because Henry wanted to connect his new dynasty to ancient British glory, and a son named Henry who would become Henry VIII. Elizabeth was reportedly kind, pious, and well-loved by the people. She never made trouble for Henry. She accepted her role as queen consort gracefully. And maybe that's the saddest part of her story, that this woman who had the strongest blood claim to the throne of England spent her entire life as a supporting character in someone else's dynasty. But even with Elizabeth at his side, even with their children combining York and Lancaster blood, Henry couldn't feel safe, because there were still people out there who remembered the House of York, people who believed that Richard III had been the rightful king, people who whispered that maybe, just maybe, one of the princes in the Tower had survived. And in 1487, just 2 years after Bosworth, those whispers turned into action. His name was Lambert Simnel. He was a 10-year-old boy from Oxford, the son of a joiner, basically a carpenter, and someone, we still don't know exactly who, trained him to impersonate Edward, Earl of Warwick, the son of George, Duke of Clarence. Remember George, the brother who was drowned in wine? His son Edward had a legitimate claim to the throne through the York bloodline. The real Edward of Warwick was locked up in the Tower of London. Henry was keeping him there precisely because Edward's claim to the throne was dangerous. But most people didn't know that. So when Lambert Simnel appeared in Ireland in 1487, claiming to be the Earl of Warwick, claiming he'd escaped from the Tower, thousands of people believed him. The Irish lords crowned him King Edward VI in Dublin. They gathered an army of Irish soldiers and German mercenaries, and they invaded England. Can you imagine how Henry must have felt? He had won the crown barely 2 years ago. He had married Elizabeth of York. He had a son and heir. He thought he had stabilised the kingdom, and now here was a 10-year-old impostor with an army, and people were actually supporting him. Henry crushed the rebellion at the Battle of Stokefield in June 1487. The Irish and German forces were slaughtered. And then Henry did something interesting. He captured Lambert Simnel alive, and instead of executing him, Henry showed mercy. He recognised that Lambert was just a child being used by adults with political agendas, so Henry gave Lambert a job in the royal kitchens as a spit-turner. Later, Lambert was promoted to work in the Royal Falconry. He lived out his life peacefully in royal service, dying around 1525. It was brilliant propaganda. Henry was showing that he was merciful, that he didn't fear pretenders, that he was so secure on his throne he could turn his enemies into servants. But the pretenders weren't done. In 1491, another young man appeared, this time claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes in the Tower. His name was Perkin Warbeck, and he was far more dangerous than Lambert Simnel because he was older, more sophisticated, and much more convincing. Perkin Warbeck claimed he had escaped when his brother was murdered, that he'd been living in hiding for years, and that he was the rightful King of England. And people believed him. The King of France believed him, or pretended to, because supporting Warbeck was a good way to destabilise England. Margaret of Burgundy, the sister of Edward IV and Richard III, recognised Warbeck as her nephew and gave him money and soldiers. Even James IV of Scotland believed him and gave Warbeck his own cousin in marriage. For 6 years, Perkin Warbeck was a constant threat to Henry VII. He tried to invade England multiple times. He built alliances across Europe. He forced Henry to spend enormous amounts of money on defence and counter-propaganda. And the worst part for Henry was that he could never completely prove Warbeck was a fraud, because nobody knew for sure what had happened to the real princes. Finally, in 1497, Warbeck's invasion of Cornwall failed. He was captured, and Henry, who had been merciful to Lambert Simnel, could not afford to be merciful again. Warbeck was imprisoned in the Tower, ironically, in the same place the real Prince Richard had disappeared. And when Warbeck tried to escape in 1499, Henry had him executed. But that wasn't enough, because as long as the real Edward, Earl of Warwick, was alive in the Tower, he would always be a potential rallying point for York loyalists. So in November 1499, Henry accused Edward of Warwick of conspiring with Perkin Warbeck to escape, and he had Edward executed. Edward was 24 years old. He had been in prison since he was 10. He had never done anything except have York blood in his veins, and for that he died. This is the dark side of the Tudor rose, the pretty symbol of red and white petals united. Behind that symbol, Henry VII systematically eliminated anyone with a strong claim to the throne. He married Elizabeth of York, yes, but he also imprisoned or executed her cousins. He talked about peace and unity, but he ruled through fear and control. And Elizabeth of York, the gentle queen who supposedly healed England's wounds, she watched her cousins die. She watched Henry destroy the last remnants of her family's power. And she said nothing, because what could she say? She was the Tudor rose too. Her children were half York, half Lancaster. To defend her York relatives would be to threaten her own son's inheritance. Elizabeth of York died in February 1503, on her 37th birthday, from complications after childbirth. Henry was reportedly devastated. He genuinely loved her, but her death was also convenient. Because Elizabeth had served her purpose, she had given Henry legitimate heirs. She had made the Tudor dynasty acceptable to York supporters. And now she was gone, and Henry could rule without the complication of a York queen who might have been more popular than he was. So let's talk about what the York dynasty actually achieved. Because yes, they lost in the end. The last York king died at Bosworth. The York princes disappeared in the Tower. The York claimants were executed or died out. But did they really fail? The House of York ruled England for only 24 years total, Edward IV for 22 years, Richard III for 2 years. That's less than a generation. But in that short time they changed England fundamentally. Edward IV modernised English government. He improved tax collection, strengthened royal finances, encouraged trade and commerce. He made England richer and more stable than it had been in decades, the economic foundation that allowed the Tudors to flourish. That was built by Edward of York. Richard III, despite his brief reign and terrible reputation, introduced legal reforms that protected common people from corrupt officials. He made the bail system fairer. He promoted people based on merit rather than noble birth. Some of the best aspects of English law came from Richard's 2 years as king, and the Tudor dynasty itself? It only existed because Henry VII married a York princess. Every single Tudor monarch, Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, Elizabeth I, had York blood in their veins through Elizabeth of York. When Elizabeth I called herself mere English, when she presented herself as the rightful heir to England's ancient glory, she was claiming her grandfather Edward IV's legacy as much as her grandfather Henry VII's. The White Rose didn't die at Bosworth. It merged with the Red Rose to create something new, something stronger. The Tudors get all the credit because they won, because they controlled the narrative, because Shakespeare wrote brilliant plays that made Richard III into a monster and Henry VII into a hero. But the truth is more complicated. The truth is that the Wars of the Roses didn't have heroes and villains. It had desperate people making impossible choices. It had fathers trying to secure their children's futures. It had mothers trying to protect their sons. It had brothers betraying brothers, wives losing husbands, children caught in power struggles they couldn't understand or control, Richard of York trying to claim his rightful inheritance and ending up with his head on a spike. Margaret of Anjou fighting to protect her son and watching him die in battle. Warwick, the kingmaker, playing both sides and dying for it. George drowned in wine, the princes in the Tower. Richard III charging at his enemies because dying as a king was better than living as a coward. Elizabeth of York marrying her family's conqueror and watching him destroy the last of her relatives. These weren't monsters or heroes. They were people, flawed, ambitious, desperate, human people caught in a system where power meant survival and weakness meant death. And the lesson, if there is a lesson in all this tragedy, is that cycles of violence are incredibly hard to break. The Wars of the Roses started in 1399, when Henry IV seized the throne from Richard II. They didn't truly end until 1503, when Elizabeth of York died and the last living connection to the old royal houses was gone. 104 years of intermittent civil war, betrayal and bloodshed. But they did end, not through total victory, but through compromise, through a marriage that united enemies, through children who carried both red and white roses in their blood, through people choosing finally to stop fighting and start building something new. The White Rose of York represents something important in English history. It represents the idea that legitimacy matters, that rightful inheritance should be respected, that women's claims to power are real, even if they can only be exercised through their sons. It represents the tragedy of civil war and the cost of ambition, and it represents the hope that even the bloodiest conflicts can eventually be healed. When you visit England today, you can still see white roses carved into medieval buildings. You can visit Fotheringhay Castle where Richard III was born. You can walk through the Tower of London where the princes disappeared. You can stand in Leicester Cathedral where Richard III is finally buried with honour. You can see the Tudor rose in Hampton Court Palace, red and white petals intertwined forever. These aren't just historical curiosities, they're reminders of what happens when we let power matter more than people, when we choose vengeance over mercy, when we refuse to compromise or forgive, when we sacrifice our children's futures for our own ambitions. The House of York failed to keep the throne, but their legacy survived in ways they never expected. In the laws Richard III passed, in the economic system Edward IV built, in the blood of every Tudor who came after, in the cautionary tale they left behind about the cost of power and the price of peace. So was the White Rose dynasty a failure? Maybe. They lost the throne after all. But maybe the real measure of their legacy isn't whether they kept power, but whether anything they fought for mattered in the end. And I think it did. I think the York dynasty, for all its tragedy and bloodshed and mistakes, helped create modern England. They just didn't live to see it. And perhaps that's the final tragedy of the House of York. They planted seeds they never got to watch grow. They built foundations others would claim credit for. They died believing they had failed, never knowing that their blood and their ideas and their sacrifices would help shape one of the greatest dynasties in English history. The White Rose bloomed in blood, as we said at the beginning of this story. But from that blood-soaked soil, something unexpected grew. Not just the Tudor rose, but the idea that even the worst conflicts can end, that enemies can become family, that the future doesn't have to repeat the past. Thank you for staying with me through this long, tragic, fascinating journey through the House of York. From Edmund of Langley choosing the White Rose as his symbol, through the bloodbath at Towton, the tragedy of the princes in the Tower, and Richard III's final charge at Bosworth, to the Tudor rose that finally brought peace. It's been a story of ambition and betrayal, love and loss, courage and cruelty. But most of all, it's been a story about people. Real people who lived and fought and died in one of the most turbulent periods in English history. I hope you've learned something. I hope you felt something. And I hope you'll remember that behind every crown, every battle, every dynasty, there are human beings with hopes and fears and families they're trying to protect. If you want to dive deeper into this period of history, there are incredible resources out there. The archaeological discovery of Richard III's body in 2012 has renewed interest in the Wars of the Roses, and there are excellent documentaries, books, and academic papers exploring these events from every angle. History is never as simple as the stories we tell. There's always more to discover. And speaking of discoveries, there are so many other incredible historical stories waiting to be told. Stories of forgotten dynasties, lost kingdoms, and people who changed the world in ways we've forgotten. So stay tuned, because the next journey through history is just beginning. Until then, remember, history isn't just about dates and battles and kings and Nisi. It's about understanding how we got here. It's about learning from the past so we can build a better future. And it's about recognizing that the people who came before us weren't so different from us after all. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about these long-dead princes and kings and queens. And thank you for being part of this journey through one of history's most beautiful and terrible stories. See you in the next one.